All right, folks, I think we might as well go ahead and get started. I'm getting a little organized here. I see we've got, looks like maybe uh, two attendees at the moment, and hopefully more will drop in, but I think we should just get started. For those of you here, welcome to Workshop 4, Inclusive Generalizable Human Subject Research and XR. Matthew, maybe if we could go to the next slide, and myself looking, and maybe even the next one. So this is most of the full day. So we will be here until 2:30 p.m. in Singapore. As you can see here are the organizers. So wanted to make sure everybody understood that myself, I'm Greg Welch, and Garrett Bruder and our PhD student Matthew Gottsucker are here in Singapore on site. If anybody wants to chat sometime during the week, we're all here. But otherwise, good, awesome group of organizers you can see here with Stevie Carnell and Gerd and I were sort of doing most of the heavy lifting, and then Janine and Grace and Valerie and Tabitha really pitching in. Jeremy will not be with us today. And if we could run to the agenda slide, then thank you. Schedule. So we're doing the introduction now, and then I will have to scoot for a little bit. Others will be taking over happily, and I will be back in about an hour. But for those of you here, we have several talks scheduled this morning, and we have 4 talks, and they're designed to sort of, the 4 of them, to set us up for discussion for later. I'll talk about the day as in it is for me here in Singapore. It's morning here now. So if I say afternoon, I mean the latter part of the workshop. So the latter part of the workshop, we will be having breakout groups and discussions as indicated here. And it will be jumping off from we hope, from the presentations that we have this morning, the awesome presentations from Dr. Valerie Taylor, Dylan Fox, Dr. Jesse Grissier, and Diane Habadian, who's here. She is if you look at the participants helping hands, she is the director of Helping Hands Monkey Helpers. And with the workshop, it is being recorded. We're actually not sure who's recording it. Our intent was to record it so that we could look at it later to get data from it, like questions and things like that. However, it appears that the organizers are recording it. We are not recording it. So it might be made public despite what our slides say. I'm updating in real time, but you can't see unless we refresh the slides. So the recording may be made public. We should adjust that if we keep these slides out, but so I want to make sure everybody understands that. One of our goals for this is to collect information and data and organize our thoughts towards some sort of an archival publication or some artifact that documents the discussions we've had, the thinking we've had, the ideas, for things to do in the future, places to focus on research, things like that. So the co-organizers and anybody who attends who's interested in being a part of this, if they, that's what we hope to do after this. And we welcome anybody who wants to join us in that. And there's a link for a Google Doc where you can enter comments, questions, thoughts. Thank you for sharing the link, Stevie. Gerd or Stevie, anything else to add?
Just so we have the discussions broken out into 2 sections for later on in the day. If you have discussion points that you'd like to bring up, feel free to add them in the Google Doc, and we'll do a slightly democratic method of choosing which ones we'll tackle first, or maybe we'll get to all of them. But feel free to add your thoughts as you're listening to our speakers, and hopefully we'll all get to discuss them later on in the afternoon/early morning hours for me.
And I was just realizing, Stevie, I think people who join us later won't see the history of the chat, so it might be a good idea to occasionally throw that link in again if any of my fellow organizers remember to do that. So newcomers will see that link. Does anybody have any questions or comments or thoughts before we start our first talk? I guess let me make one point for the non-organized, for the attendees. It's a little hard, maybe for me sometimes, to wrap my head around this, but this workshop really is about user studies or about human subject research. So we're really trying to think about the user, the participants or the study participants or the users in our studies, and thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, accessibility with respect to them, for the purpose of both it's societally important and also scientifically important. And more people in this community, XR community, ISMAR, VR, and related communities are recognizing both that people have always known it's important, but sort of the level of the imperative to do something about this is really increasing, and the voices are getting louder to do something. So we really want to try and understand where some of the big problems are for those of us who are relatively new to the space. We have speakers today who are not. I'm speaking for myself. So our 4 speakers this morning are not. They are experts in these areas. So they're going to help us come up to speed so that the rest of us can try and pitch in and do some good things if we can in this space. All right.
Yes.
So with that, yeah, go ahead, Steve.
I was just going to say we can maybe transition to our speakers now. I was going to ask Dr. Taylor if she wanted to share her slides, or I can share them for her.
Yes, I can share them.
Okay, I'll stop then.
All right.
While she's getting that prepared, I'll go into a quick intro for Dr. Taylor. Dr. Taylor is an associate professor of psychology at Lehigh University, I believe. She's an experimental social psychologist, and she holds a joint appointment in the Africana Studies program at Lehigh University. Her research areas include social identity threat, intergroup contact, stereotyping and discrimination, cultural psychology, and applications of emerging technologies in the study of intergroup relations. So it looks like her slides are ready to go, so I'll let her take over and speak.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here with us today. As was noted, I am Valerie Jones-Taylor, an experimental social psychologist, and I just kind of like to share kind of what I do to this audience so that all of it kind of makes sense. So broadly, I study interracial interactions in the context of virtual reality, and specifically in VR STEM contexts. And in my work, I look at how we might use VR technology to reduce people's discomfort in interracial interactions through training and practice. And so, as you might imagine, I think quite a lot about how people engage with or treat avatars of different racial, ethnic, genders, etc., and how biases can spread and also be thwarted during our interactions in the metaverse. So I come to you as a member of this community, deeply caring about the issues of racial and gender equity, as well as equity across all other dimensions of identity, from age to disability status, and so on. So now, as the first talk in this session, I just think it's important to start our day-long conversation with thoughtful consideration of why we should begin implementing diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI practices into our human subjects research in AR, VR, XR, and mixed reality, and how to do so now. So I just encourage us to keep all of this in mind, front and center, as we go throughout the day. So though these technologies, of course, are not in their infancy, we all know this, as with all emerging technologies across time, they are created and built by humans who do have biases. So historically, research in AR, VR, XR, and development has been a space that has lacked demographic diversity. So it's been predominated by white, middle to upper class, cisgendered, able-bodied, college-educated men, most often located in the global West. So however, Of course, our world and increasingly the metaverse is inhabited by people from many different backgrounds, be it along dimensions of gender, race, ethnicity, region of the country or world, language, sexual orientation, disability status, neurodivergence, social class. Of course, just to name a few. You could see a number of other categories listed here on the slide. So there is no reason to believe that our technologies, those that we build and test, of course, will be immune to these human biases, which are currently built into most of our interactive human-centered technologies. So while all research in this space does not and really should not need to explicitly target issues of DEI, it is imperative that we consider how our technology impacts the lives of all users during its ideation, creation, and dissemination. So though many of you may be aware of the DEI issues that we face, I'll start by highlighting a few salient concerns that often surface in our work and in this field, and why they just simply can't be ignored. So first, there are many dimensions of identity that not only matter to how individuals see themselves, but how they experience the world, and by extension, the metaverse and related hardware that can enable or inhibit access in the metaverse. However, many identity dimensions are simply not recognized in this space, from the creation of platforms to the technology that we use to enter this ever-expanding space. And when such meaningful identity dimensions are not considered or recognized or represented in a space, people will experience a lack of belonging there and can feel as if they're not welcome, or that their concerns will be ignored or dismissed. And these outcomes have been extensively documented in social psychological research, the field I'm most prominently in, both in real world and virtual environments. So for example, individuals from different racial and ethnic backgrounds have been shown to experience VR and interactions in the metaverse differently. They may experience racial bias, gender bias, while others may not. Some may experience invisibility, while others may not, etc. And such bias has not only been found in the realm of real people's experiences engaging in the metaverse, but of course also in research. Dr. Tabitha Peck and colleagues, for example, find that the underrepresentation of women leads to biased research that excludes the ideas and the experiences of women when they're not on the research teams and also not considered in the participant samples themselves, right? So some of the phenomenon that we document could be really different, or issues could be solved, right? If we have greater representation, they find, of course, of women in this domain. And unfortunately, the societal impacts of these technologies and innovations are often discovered retrospectively. So that is, these sorts of innovations are often not, these issues are often not considered or addressed until after issues are found in the research process, or of course, when complaints begin to arise. So we lack representation of many sorts here, but much research has documented the importance of having diverse work and research teams, and of course, representative and diverse participant samples. So for example, there's much evidence documenting that more diverse teams have greater knowledge base, better decision-making, greater creativity and innovation, greater output, and greater economic growth. So that's often important for people who are really interested in, quote, the bottom line or the monetary gains. So these are really important when it comes to improving the diversity of our teams. And this is diversity broadly defined, but specifically it's been looked at in the context of gender and race, and in particular. And likewise, more diverse and demographically representative participant populations allow us to have better experimental data in the research that we do, which is sort of the core of what we want to talk about here today. And we're able to generalize our results better. So that's important because when we are investigating different phenomenon or hardware, software, things that will perhaps move into industry, it's important to know that these technologies work well for all people that we are interested in reaching. And of course, we hope to be reaching all people in the world. Right? So I just want to highlight in this case, sort of a call to action that our colleague, Tabitha Peck, has really put forth in some of her previous work, talking about the various things that we can do really to think about improving our participant samples and the research that we do. So I'll go through a few of these things here now. Um, right. So of course, as mentioned, thinking about population diversity is really integral into the research that we do. As I just noted, our ability to, our ability to generalize the research is really important. And if we don't have a diverse sample, and again, that's diversity, often we don't think about disability status, neurodivergence, socioeconomic status, things like that. Often people in different populations don't even have access to the hardware. So thinking about how to get the hardware to them and et cetera, is really important to be able to do the research in the first place. So this is something that's really imperative for us to consider when we're doing our research. It's noted that it's important to, of course, recruit outside of our universities or our companies. Of course, we often have really niche areas that we are interested in, and our networks can be quite small. So it's important to really reach outside of that to increase the people that we are engaging with, which can help the diversity of our teams, and also, of course, those that we're recruiting to participate in our research as well. So in our work, we must, of course, constantly think about how we're evaluating the evaluation methods, those things we are using as metrics to see who is on our team and who we are having in our participant sample. And of course, we can't do this as a one-shot sort of evaluation. It's really important when we're doing this work, especially when people in the DEI space think about how we are evaluating what we're doing and seeking to improve, that we're constantly reevaluating our metrics and looking forward to better ways to improve how we are garnering our participants and meeting the needs of our constituents. Now, this next one is really important when we are publishing our work, when we are presenting our work to the larger community at different spaces and institutions, universities, and often at conferences as well, is to include inclusive imagery. That's because we are then representing a diversity of people in the work that we're doing. And it's important not only for those who are reading our work to understand how the participant samples that we may have, the teams we're including, but to use this to suggest or to show that we are including more populations to be more inclusive in our work as well. And importantly, what we find in a lot of social psychological research is that when people see themselves, if they are a member of an underrepresented population or community in the work represented in this way, they often feel like they could be there. They feel a sense of belonging. And that's really important in increasing the representation of the teams that we have, for example. Likewise, it's important to build relationships with affinity groups. That's both inside the institutional, in our institutions, excuse me, and outside of our institutions. And so what we mean by that, for example, is just making sure that you have connections with the local extended reality communities that may have a more diverse population to draw from when we're doing this research, and people that we can collaborate with. Oftentimes, we really stick in our homogeneous intellectual communities, for example. So broadening those relationships with other groups is important as well. And likewise, it's important to consider collaborators from different or diverse geographic locales. So of course, we know that's the case just in the countries in which we may live, but it's also important extending outside of our continent, not our continents, yes, that is the right word, and the countries that we live in. Of course, people in different regions around the country, our countries and around the world have different experiences, different access to these technologies, and understanding some of the challenges that they may have is really important in developing this work as well. So there's a lot of research that we currently have, and it's important to really consider replicating a lot of this work to include underrepresented populations, to confirm that many of the findings that we have and that we show generalize to these underrepresented populations. And of course, we know one area that has been heavily documented is that of simulator sickness, and some of the challenges in this area, and just literally having not really thinking about the hardware and how it's built and created has led to women experiencing greater motion sickness when they wear these headsets. And so the research that people have been able to do to sort of document this issue has assisted us in changing this area and we've begun to create better technology to meet the needs of different populations. And we don't know all the areas that we are currently missing right now. So it is and would be important to replicate a lot of work that we really consider foundational, not only replicate with underrepresented populations, but replicate with larger sample sizes. So that's been a big thing that's come into play in the last 5 to 10 years, is really increasing our sample sizes, of course, to ensure that we can approximate a normal distribution. I teach that sometimes, and also know that we really are looking at things that matter in these populations and that we can find differences if they are there and address them appropriately. So when we do this, it's important to collect and then report the diversity data of the participants that we are sampling. Right. So that shows that not only we've made the effort to attempt to diversify our participant samples, but that we really have attempted to report that data so that we know how it generalizes and if it generalizes well or not. Right. So as we are conducting this work, we need to really actively consider or think of the perspective of others. A lot of research by Jeremy Baleson and other people have really thought a lot about empathy and how just thinking through putting ourselves in the shoes of others when they're using this technology. And this is really important. I know Dylan Fox will talk a bit more about this in a moment, when we're thinking about people of different disability status, neurodivergence, et cetera. These are populations we often do not consider when we're creating our technology, our software, when we're doing the human subjects research, et cetera. And we are just completely ignoring a large parts of our population when we're doing this. Of course, it can be hard sometimes at first when we're starting out this work to have people represented across the spectrum on our team, but at least starting here, right, to consider how other people may experience this technology or these platforms is a really important first step. And of course, at a more structural level, I'll turn there for a moment, is thinking about diversifying those in charge. And when we say those in charge, we mean those in our institutions, at our conferences, journals, editorial boards, things like that, really, because that's just been shown to have, when we have representation, it increases people being interested in these fields, in this research, on the teams that we want to build. And again, it changes the innovation, the creativity, and the growth of our work as well. So we also don't want to think about just diversifying the people on our team, but also at all levels of the work and in the institutions that we are a part of. And of course, as we're doing here, really thinking seriously about engaging in professional growth and development of these DEI practices. It's something that is really important. I like to talk about it as encouraging or adopting a growth mindset, because often we think these one-shot Conversations or workshops about these issues means we have checked a box and we could sort of go on with our lives, but it's something that we must continuously practice and think about in the research that we do. And we like to call it a growth mindset compared to a fixed mindset, because we know that it is sometimes hard. Growing can be hard and challenging, and we have to stay engaged at the same time. So I just kind of wanted to think about all of these things, this call to action, as Peck and colleagues have talked about in this area, is really important for moving our field forward in being more inclusive in the research that we do and the populations that we are including in our research. So of course, this call to action may be clear, but actually getting there and even getting started is what is often the challenging thing to do. So now I'll transition into highlighting a few things that I think we all can do as a field to improve the quality of our research and particularly its ability to generalize across groups. Okay. So the first thing I want to talk about are just simply questions for consideration when we're doing this research. And I like to call this the low-hanging fruit, something that we all can do that shouldn't be a challenge for us to do. And then I'll turn to talk about actions really to increase the representation of our teams and of our participant samples. All right. So as I noted, when we think about questions for consideration, these are questions that should be done with our teams when we start a project, or if we've already begun a project, a research project, when we're writing up our results so that we can properly report and situate our findings, given potential limitations that we may have in the data that we've collected. Of course, we always report our limitations, but we also want to think about these potential limitations in the DEI space as well. So I call these low-hanging fruit. These questions that I'll note here just require that we acknowledge our assumptions and really seek to challenge them in our work. So first, as noted, it's important to consider our perspective and the perspectives that we have when we're entering into the work that we do. And so one question that we often ask on our team is, and we can ask each other, does your work have the potential to impact people from different social groups in different or unexpected ways, right? So just as we're starting a research project, or as we are thinking about reporting this work or presenting at a conference, think about this question. Does our work have the potential to impact people from different social groups in different and or unexpected ways? And this is important to address in our talk or in the limitations of our work as well. Another question that we all can ask ourselves is to consider the content of our work. So does the content of our work, and that could be, does the content of our work really include things that examine topics related to physical or mental disability, topics related to age, gender, race, ethnicity, SES, historically underrepresented geographic locales, and what does this mean, right? And so if the content of our work does relate to this, it's important to acknowledge that or think about whether some aspects of our work may be relevant, right, to these groups and what that means for interpreting our results, right? Of course, it's important to consider our team. So who are the members of a research team involved in the work that we do? And I like to talk about this again broadly because we can begin thinking about diversifying our teams by thinking about their backgrounds, of course, different forms of diversity, their career stage. That's an important form of diversity that we can bring to a research collaboration, and even the affiliation type, right? So thinking about people at undergraduate institutions, for example, doing research, for those at institutions that have graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, the different types of resources that people have at these different sorts of institutions, and the importance it is often is for collaborating with people at these different types of institutions to enable our ability to increase the diversity of our teams. And a final important question is to consider the sample. Of course, who are the research participants in the sample? Who is left out? And again, what might that mean for our interpretation? Right? So these are literally questions we have when we start our work that we just run down as a team to make sure we're thinking about them at all stages of the research process, right? And of course, when you can't really answer these questions in the way that you want to, it's imperative to really think hard about how you can address them, right? So it really invites us to draw on the strengths that we have in our community to really invite them to the table. All right. And so now, after we ask ourselves these questions, I want to talk a little bit about just a few actions that we can use to increase representation right now, right? And again, that's representation both in our research teams and in our participant samples. And I first want to talk about it. I want to talk about it at two levels. One as structural strategies and as individual strategies. So I'll start structurally. Those are often the hardest to change, but the most often very important in getting individual people to change. All right. So I'll start there. And just as we've been brainstorming and thinking about how we might do this, we're considering thinking at conferences, for example, having sessions where different people can really pitch their lab to others. And this is an opportunity for people who may not have access to you as a eminent scholar, for example, or a person doing particular types of research, just for them to see you put a face to the work in a space where one can walk up, more easily ask questions, very informal space where you're talking about the work that you do. And I call this structural because it would be a change that a conference could literally make to set aside time. It could be through a lunch period, for example, when people are eating and kind of sharing the work, where it lowers the bar for people to actually engage in these more informal conversations that allows people to meet each other. And this often just provides an opportunity for people from different groups to see the work of others, to know what's out there and to understand what they might be able to become involved in. And something else that is important to consider is putting badges on papers at conferences that highlight the different things that your research team attempted to do to address the issues that we've discussed today. It could be thinking about the diversity of your sample, your team, the generalizability of your work to different populations, the inclusiveness of your sample, etc. And so these are things we can think about, like what would be important to acknowledge to our peers that we've sought to do in our work. And so now I'll sort of turn to some of the individual strategies that we can adopt as individual researchers and teams. But it was important to talk about these structural strategies first so that we know so that's easier for us to engage in some of these individual strategies. And of course, the first one is to remind us of these questions that we need to ask ourselves at the start of our work and also throughout the work and the dissemination of our work as well. And this will then lead us to be able to actually diversify our team. So thinking about how our teams are how our teams are created, we have to open up our existing networks. And doing something like being able to pitch our lab at a conference actually allows us to open up our existing network to people who may not have had an opportunity to have seen that work or to engage with us in the first place. And so to get there, of course, may feel hard, but it is something really important that we just have to say is a call to action, something that we have to strive to do, increasing the representation on our research teams and thus increasing the samples that we engage with in our work will increase the rigor and the generalizability of our work. And so as a little bit later, as we go into the workshops and talk more about some of these ideas, I just want to leave you with these structural strategies and these individual strategies for thinking about and think seriously about the feasibility of these actions and how we in our community might hold ourselves and each other accountable as well. Right. Because I think that's another issue that we often encounter is how we can hold each other accountable and do this without it feeling like an extra burden that we all have to carry or that some of us have chosen to carry. That's why it's important to consider and really take seriously the structural change that is necessary to move us all to reporting our demographic data and to working towards having more diverse participant samples. And so with that, I will just stop and thank you for your time. And I have a few moments if there's any questions, or I know we may have to transition over to our next speaker. Thank you.
If anyone has questions, feel free to type them in the chat, or hopefully you can unmute and ask them directly. Either one's fine. If not, I have a quick thought. Maybe I can get an answer to, or the idea of an answer. One of the things that I was thinking about when you were talking about the Picture Lab opportunities, and something that I've worked on in the past is the diversity and inclusion chair for a conference, is that there's a limited number of people at the conference, particularly in terms of the students that are involved. They're already involved in the VR space in some way. So I was curious if you had any ideas about how we can increase the kinds, or diversify the kinds of students that are involved, or get them involved in VR at an earlier stage to kind of help widen that student pool that's participating in these conferences.
Yes, so I've thought about that as well. And one thing I've begun to do is actually when I run my research studies and collect the data, I'm really intentional about the debriefing process, how I'm talking about the work we're doing and the data we're collecting, what it means, what it will be used for, privacy concerns, and especially because in a lot of our work, we're dealing with more sensitive topics of race and ethnicity, we take a lot of time to debrief and think through this. And we always ask people, are they interested in the work and these opportunities? And in that way, I've actually engaged more students of color across different ethnicities and races, and actually students of different gender identities as well in this work, by literally engaging them after they've been participants. Oftentimes, people want to know why what they are doing matter. And I think that's a really important way to start to open up the field to people who may never have considered this an option in the first place.
Oh, that's a great tip. Thank you. I'll be sure to add that in the notes. Okay, so I think we should transition to our next speaker now. Dylan, would you like to share your own slides, or?
Yep, happy to share my screen here.
Okay, then I will. Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say thank you to Valerie. That was a fantastic talk.
Yes. While you're setting your slides up, I'll introduce you briefly. Dylan Fox is a UX design and accessibility consultant who also serves as the head of community and engagement for XR Access, which is responsible for empowering the XR Access work streams and spreading the importance of XR accessibility to the public. He also conducts research at UC Berkeley on uses of augmented reality for people with low vision and sits on the W3C Immersive Captions Community Group and IEEE Global Initiative on Ethics of Extended Reality. So thank you very much for being with us today, and you can take it away.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Stevie. Yeah, so let me talk to you all today about XR accessibility for human subjects. Stevie, I think, gave a great introduction. So say no more. Other than that, if you have questions on any of the following, feel free to reach out to me, Dylan at drfoxdesign.com. I will also be posting a link to the slide deck after the presentation, or if anybody needs it right now, I'm happy to share it as well. So got a lot to cover today. We only got half an hour, but I really want to give everybody here kind of a little bit of a crash course in XR accessibility, since it's something that often gets kind of left on the sidelines or left to some kind of unnamed expert who may or may not come in. And I think really, if we want to see it happen, we need everybody to know at least the basics. And so that is what I'm here to do. So today we're going to talk briefly about the XR Access initiative that I work with. We're going to talk about what is XR accessibility, give some examples of both classic and XR accessibility, talk a little bit about accessibility in human subjects research. I'll give you some resources to implement this in your own work, and hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So starting with the XR Access Initiative. So we are a community founded in 2019 to engage and connect XR creators with the goal of making XR inclusive of everyone, regardless of ability. We are a research initiative out of Cornell Tech, and we were founded by a mixture of Cornell, Yahoo, and PEAT, which is the Partnership on Employment and Accessible Technologies from the US Department of Labor. Our vision is to really make inclusive design a core part of XR creation, that we don't even think about making XR accessible because it's separately from making XR. We want to make sure that there are widespread resources that are available and accurate. We want to make sure that people with disabilities are a big part of innovation and that their voices aren't left unheard. And we want to consider intersectionality because, as we just saw, there are many ways to be left out, to be discriminated against. And we want to make sure that everyone is being a part of these discussions. Our stakeholders are pretty wide and varied. We tend to consider ourselves a little bit of a boundary group. We help all of these different people talk to each other and become aware of the challenges that exist and how to face them. So that includes researchers and end users, includes app and content creators, platforms, products and associations, policymakers, educators, and finally consultants and employers looking to use XR in their work. So let's talk first for a moment about what is XR accessibility. I'm sure folks here are probably familiar. I tend to give this talk either to people familiar in XR or people familiar with accessibility. So we cover all our bases here. So XR is extended reality, which can mean virtual reality, where you are immersed in a digitally generated experience accessible via head-mounted display or by a web browser. It's augmented reality, which digitally augmented experiences are rendered as an overlay on your field of view. And you have mixed reality, where there's a little bit of both. You get both physical and digital objects in the same space. Now, that's XR. What about accessibility? Accessibility really means that something is usable regardless of ability. And we firmly believe that accessibility is a human right, and that accessibility creates better experiences for everyone, including those whose including those whose disability is only temporary or situational, because that is something that we encounter a lot. People think about disability as being a person in a wheelchair or a person who is permanently blind, permanently deaf. But that is really only one potential axis of ability and disability. If you are in a situation where you are temporarily unable to use one of your senses or one of your motor capabilities, you are disabled, right? If you have an arm injury or an ear infection, all of these things that we're going to be talking about are going to be helpful to you. Similarly, disability can be situational, right? If you're a new parent and you have one arm holding a baby, well, guess what? You're going to benefit from the same features that benefit an amputee. So one of the things to think about as we go through all of these is that accessibility is not just helping this portion of the population that has a permanent disability. Accessibility is helping all of us because we are all disabled at different times. Thinking more about then XR accessibility, when you combine both of those, there's two kind of camps that a lot of research and products fall into. And that is first core XR platform accessibility. This is the idea that everything that we make in XR should be accessible, right? We don't want to have these 5 apps that are for blind people and then all of these apps for everyone else. We want to say that everything from the social VR to the training to the healthcare to whatever should all be accessible if possible. And then on the other hand, we have XR as assistive technology. This is XR tech that is aimed specifically at people with disabilities, right? This is something like Seeing AI from Microsoft, right? Where if you're not blind, you might not get a lot of use out of it. But if you are, it's going to have a suite of tools really aimed to improve your quality of life tremendously. And when it comes to either of these, it's really important to practice inclusive co-design, making sure that you are working with people with disabilities in order to make products better for them and therefore better for everyone. And finally, I'm going to mention, why is XR accessibility important? Well, XR is growing fast. I think we are all here because we believe this. There's a lot of capabilities that XR can be put to that we still have barely touched the surface on in industry and entertainment, in healthcare and training, all kinds of things, especially with the remote work that a lot of us find ourselves doing these days. Secondly, because people with disabilities need accessibility in order to have equitable access to jobs, to education, to healthcare, and to entertainment and games and social media, the things that make work possible, the things that make life worth living. People with disabilities deserve access to these things. They shouldn't be locked out just because the creators didn't think of their needs during the creation process. And finally, XR accessibility is important because of the curb cut effect. For those not familiar, the curb cut effect is basically the idea that curb cuts, as you see here in the photo attached, were originally put in to support people with wheelchairs, but really make life a lot easier for people who are using strollers, for people using skateboards, for people using dollies. When you tend to make something better for more accessible, it makes it better for everyone. And I apologize. I should be describing the imagery here as we go through. This photo is from MIT Black History, featuring Charles Cofield, who's one of the activists that fought for curb cuts. It's a Black man who is guiding his wheelchair down a curb cut in the sidewalk. So with that, let's talk about some real examples of accessibility. And so for each of these, I'm going to show what accessibility means kind of traditionally for digital media, and then we're going to talk about what it looks like in XR. So starting with vision. So some good practices for vision, for people to make visual things accessible for everyone. Make sure you have good color contrast. Make sure you have good legible fonts. Try to use things like stylized fonts sparingly. Try to make sure that if you have an aesthetic, make sure it's an accessible one. Never use color as the only means of conveying a message. And of course, sure most people are familiar with here, make sure you add alt text to your images so that people who are using screen readers can understand what's going on. Now, that is all applicable to XR. What I'm showing you here is a picture of a Unity project called Seeing VR. This was something that was put together by Professor Yuheng Zhao when she was at Cornell in combination with Microsoft. And it was a prototype for applying things like magnification, edge enhancement, recoloring, text augmentation, object description, AI-powered site interpretation, all these really powerful tools in a VR environment. It was an amazing thing when it came out. Problem is, it's still right now just kind of a Unity prototype, an old version of Unity now, that really hasn't made it into these features haven't really made it into a lot of places. And so think about when you're making your XR application, think about the people who are low vision that are going to be using it, and think about whether they could benefit from aspects like this. And then go click on the prototype and see how you can include it in your own builds, because being able to include tools like this is going to make it, again, more usable for people who have low vision, also more usable for people who are on low-end headsets that maybe don't have the resolution to display nice, crisp text. Yeah. So moving on to hearing. The big number one thing for people who have low hearing is captions. Make sure you include captions. Make sure that they are preferably they're legible. Ideally, that they're customizable. Letting the user set the size, the font, the background to whatever makes them comfortable. It's going to be really helpful. Make sure these captions also include things like descriptions of important noises or kind of ambient mood, whatever would be provided by the sound. Include something equivalent in your captions. That's really one of the core things for accessibility as a whole, is anything that is being communicated through one sense, make sure you're communicating it through another sense as well. So for hearing, that means anything that would be coming through sound, make sure you're communicating that through vision or through another sense. Another good important thing for hearing, and also for sensory, folks with sensory disabilities, we'll get to it in a bit, is separate controls for different things like sound effects and music, because people may need help identifying the core things over others. And if you can let them choose what they want to listen to and at what volume, that's going to be really helpful. Now, again, all of that apply when you get to XR, but you also have new challenges. So here we are looking at a clip of Vacation Simulator from Alchemy Labs, and captions are, tricky enough when you just have a rectangle, a screen where okay, here's the screen, here's what's on screen, here's where you can just put captions on the bottom of the screen. But VR and AR don't necessarily have a bottom of the screen, right? It may have people's vision, but that's going to be moving all around, right? And you have to consider in XR, how are you indicating who's speaking, right? How are you showing where the source of that sound is? How do you handle occlusion, right? If these captions are moving in 3D space and an object comes up in between them, what do you do? These are not answered questions, right? I think you'll find with a lot of XR accessibility work, it's still being figured out right now. And stuff like this is what we discuss in the W3C immersive captions meeting twice a month. We talk about what are the best practices. How should you handle captions for a party when there's people all around you and all talking at once? Do you have a million speech bubbles? Do you prioritize? There's a lot of open questions here, but make sure that you are considering them and you do something to address them, right? We often hear, oh man, nobody knows how to do it. It's really hard. Therefore, we're not going to bother even trying to make our stuff accessible. And that is just infinitely disappointing, because not only you're hurting, all the folks out there that might be able to benefit from your applications or your research, you're hurting yourself by not having access to those people. So there's a lot of examples to work from in the resource I'm going to give you at the end. And if you decide you want to make the effort, we at XR Access will help you to do that. So make an effort and put something in there, because you're going to be helping out everybody. Next, let's talk about physical disabilities. So this includes people with motor disabilities of all different kinds. Also applies a lot to screen reader users, for those who are blind. Make sure that your applications can be used via keyboard or other different types of inputs. Never have folks relying on only using the mouse or only using motion controls, because you're going to be locking out a lot of people that just don't have the physical dexterity to do that. In traditional web and mobile accessibility, what you do is you do things like define a focus order, right? If you just tab your way, hit tab to move focus from one element to the next, to the next, to the next, it moves in a clear and kind of logical order through each element. You can have each element be read out by the screen reader, or just indicated that it's in focus for anyone, and be able to interact with those elements. For mobile, you want to make sure that you have the touch spaces that are big enough. I think 44 by 44 pixels is the default recommendation, that people who don't have fine motor control can still hit them reliably. And you want to offer alternative interfaces such as voice, in order to again have that modularity, and make sure that in the same way that you don't want to have output going only through one sense, you don't want to have input only going through one capability. You want to give people lots of ways to interact with your application, because the more ways you give them, the more likely they're going to be able to use at least one of them. Now, with XR, as you might imagine, there's a lot more physical demands being made of users in a lot of these kind of full motion capture type experiences. What you're looking at here is a software called Walk-in VR Driver that lets folks do all kinds of things. I'll go on to the next slide, but you can see here that there's the expectation that people will be able to look around. They're able to move their whole body left and right in order to react to things in their environment. And as a gamer, this is amazing, right? It's no longer just hit a button to swing your sword. You actually get to swing your sword, raise your shield. It's very exciting, but it's also very limiting for people that can't do that. And so you want to make sure that you're including alternative ways to enable folks that don't have that type of dexterity, that type of motor capability to use your applications. One way of doing this is, again, the Walk-in VR Driver. This is a piece of technology that works, I think right now, only with Steam VR, but offers features like co-piloting. So letting a physical, more able-bodied person kind of support you and co-pilot your experience. Virtual motion and rotation. So you can let the controller kind of pretend to be further up or down, amplify the motion. So if you only have a small range of motion, it can turn that into a big range of motion in the experience, or vice versa. Adjust the position, so you can use apps whether you're seated or standing or even lying down, and hand tracking to, again, offer a different type of input, so you don't have to be able to hold a controller steadily for however many minutes at a time in order to be able to use the application. Moving through, cognitive is kind of a tricky one, but thankful in that it aligns a lot with just good user experience design. But for folks with cognitive disabilities, the main thing is really making sure that you're designing your applications in a way that isn't overwhelming, right? You don't want to give folks too much info at once. You want to provide clear instructions, tutorials, make things forgiving with good error messages and undo functionalities, and make sure that things are easy to review, that information isn't given all in one glob and then taken away and never shown again. You want to make sure that you can access that help as you need it. We have two good examples of this here. One from the kind of web world, where we have a bookstore that offers a little kind of question mark, contextual help and options to learn more about what's going on. And we also see an example from Google Tilt Brush, where in VR they offer a beginner mode. You can choose to have your controls hide a lot of the more kind of complex functions and just have a nice basic selection of tools so you don't overwhelm new users. Finally, the last dimension of accessibility I'll talk about here is sensory. This has overlap with some of the previous ones, but there's a lot of folks who are neurodiverse who can get overwhelmed very easily by different types of sensory overload, or who may, for example, be at risk for epileptic seizures. So really make sure you have ways to cut down the amount of animations, the amount of sound, amount of automatically playing things that are being blasted at the user. And here we're showing a tool that is the photosensitive epilepsy analysis tool, confusingly also acronym of PEAT, that can actually scan video and understand whether it's at risk of having somebody have a seizure who's susceptible to that. Now with XR, as you might imagine, an immersive experience has a lot of opportunity for people with sensory disabilities to get overwhelmed. So I'm going to play you a clip from a short film here called Hyperreality about what not to do when you drop somebody into an XR application.
Estoy presente ahora. Me amo. Estoy libre de mi ira. Estoy libre de mi tristeza. El amor speaks for me.
Adiós. Olá, me llamo María.
So as you can see, restraint is often your friend when it comes to XR. It's easy as experienced users to forget just how overwhelming it is to be dropped into a virtual experience. And you really want to limit the amount of information you're giving people as much as you can and introduce things one at a time. And trust me, that is going to help people with disabilities especially, but it's going to help all of your users when it comes to getting people comfortable in these environments. So moving on from the examples here, I'm just going to talk very briefly, because I know we only have a few minutes left, on accessibility in human subjects research. First thing I'm going to say is the primary commandment of inclusive disability work is nothing about us without us. It is vitally important to include people with disabilities at all stages of the research, design, development, and user testing process. Really, the earlier you can bring folks on board, the better. And this applies whether you're working on something that's a piece of assistive technology or not, because the later it gets in the process, the harder and more expensive it's going to be to make something accessible. Really think about pilot programs where you get feedback from a variety of folks with disabilities before you design your main studies. Closely related to this is the concept of disability dongles. So when you're thinking even about what research to conduct, consider the case of the dongle. A disability dongle, as defined by disabled activist Liz Jackson, is an elegant and well-intended but ultimately useless solution to a problem people with disabilities never knew they had. So these are things like sign language translation gloves that are made without input from people with disabilities and don't actually help them. Sign language translation gloves are one of those things that people with often well-intentioned but not well-informed engineers will invent over and over and over again without really realizing that nobody in the deaf community asked for them. They're never going to actually translate sign language, because sign language has a lot to do with facial expression and body language, and it's really just not a good place to invest your time and effort. So again, consult with the folks that you're trying to help before you spend a million hours and $1 million trying to help them. More broadly speaking, when I'm going to give you some principles here taken from a piece by Brian Grellman, A Comprehensive Guide to Accessible User Research. When you're planning your research, consider, are your recruitment forms and your testing materials accessible? Does your candidate pool include people with disabilities? Is your testing location accessible? Does your budget cover travel? Because often folks with disabilities cannot drive themselves to get to you. And have you considered the needs of caretakers and interpreters who may be accompanying your testers? When you're conducting research, consider, is your staff trained in disability etiquette? You don't want to have somebody come out and say, ah, yes, the cripple is here. It's not a good look. What do you do if a participant can't find your lab or becomes fatigued during the process, or your equipment can't be accessed or calibrated? I was just running some research where the HoloLens 2 we were using couldn't really calibrate itself to the people with low vision because they weren't using their center vision, they're using the peripheral vision. You have to be ready for those types of eventualities. And again, this is a really good reason to run a pilot program to expose these types of issues. And finally, when you're reporting research, consider, does your publication note the levels of disability among your participants? Good reporting is really essential for seeing whether we're making any progress on this. Do you differentiate between accessibility issues and broader usability issues that can affect anybody? And have you reflected at the end of all this on your accessibility successes and failures? Because really every study is an opportunity to do better on the next one. So finally, I'm going to leave you here with some resources. Hopefully I've impressed upon you the importance of making your research accessible and some of the types of things that you might do to do that. So here's the stuff that will help make that a reality. Number one is the XR Accessibility Project. This is kind of a one-stop shop. It's a mega index of accessibility resources that we at XR Access have been putting together with the support of the XR Association, with a ton of resources on what it means for things to be accessible and how to make them accessible. So check that out for sure. I'll put the link in the chat here. If you use the xra.org link, you have to make sure to get the capitalization right. But take a look at that. It's been certified as a digital public good by the DPGA, something that helps try to support the Millennium Goals. So take a look at that. For folks here, I would specifically recommend looking at the BBC XR Barriers browser. This is something that came out of an absolute ton of work that Jamie Knight and his sidekick Lion did on basically exactly this. When you do human subjects research, what types of barriers are you going to encounter? For example, for motor barriers, they encountered problems with people being able to hold the controllers, problems with being able to keep the right orientation, problems with being able to press and hold a particular button, problems with being able to enter multiple inputs at once, and problems being able to reach for virtual objects. So they've documented a ton of things, mostly in motor, cognitive, and a little bit of visual, but learn from their experiences, their months of bringing in people with disabilities, trying out different research projects, and finding out, yeah, we need to re-engineer this so that they can even try the experiment we originally brought them in for. And finally, let XR Access be your resource. We exist to help make this happen. You can check out our website is xraccess.org. Our email is info@xraccess.org. And we have a Slack where anybody is welcome to join and discuss this type of thing. It's bit.ly/xraccess-slack. I'll put that in the chat. We really love to have folks come by and say, hey, I'm so-and-so, I'm researching this, and I would love to understand how I can make this more accessible to people in the disabled community. So that is my spiel. I hope y'all enjoyed it. I don't know how we're doing on time, if we have time for Q&A, but if regardless, be absolutely delighted to connect with anyone here and help answer those questions and make the world just a little bit more accessible.
Great talk. Thank you. If anyone, again, has any questions, feel free to type them in the chat or hop in on the mic. If not, I can ask a question again, because I was really interested in the point you made about, I guess, like one of the big selling things about a lot of the VR experiences now is that they have spatialized audio. And so one of the problems it sounds like the community is, or the challenges the community is facing is how do we convey that information in another way? I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the different methods that have been explored, or what seems to kind of work, or anything you can kind of share in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, I think being able to communicate information in different ways is a big challenge, but thankfully one that is shared across more than just accessibility realms, right? So we have a lot of folks that have realized when you're trying to direct somebody's vision to a particular part of the VR world, one of the things you can do is tricks with lighting, right? So make the unimportant areas dark, make the important area light up, and people will naturally turn to look at the light. That would be a very interesting alternative to having just audio of somebody shouting at you, hey, look over here. There's also a lot of research to be done in haptics. We're actually planning a big discussion on haptics with the XR Association for early next year, because there's a lot of ways that we could use the sense of touch to help communicate things from either vision or hearing, whether that's through controller vibration or some type of wearable vest, or some of the ultrasound, not ultrasound, the sound haptics that let you like feel something in midair. There's a lot of things to experiment with here. So it's really ripe for research and for products, and I'm looking forward to seeing what comes out over the next few years.
Yeah, it seems like it'll be a really open space, or there's a lot of different ways it can go. So it's pretty cool.
Absolutely.
Hopefully someone here will be involved in it too. Okay, great. Thank you, Dylan. And then I'm going to turn it over to our next speaker, just for the sake of time. I'm sure we could all ask a few more questions, but Jesse, do you want to share your own slides, or I can share them for you?
I'm getting so ready to share my slides that I can't go back to Zoom to find the unmute.
Okay, fair enough. While she's setting up her slides, I will give, again, a quick introduction. Dr. Jessie Grieser is an associate professor of linguistics at the University of Michigan. She's a sociolinguist, and her research focuses on the use of African American language style in the creation and maintenance of identities, which are not necessarily ethno-racial in nature, particularly identities of place and class. She also investigates geosemiotics and the study of language online. So I think I'm picking up on a theme here today. We've been talking a lot about different identities, and we'll, I guess, like close off this info session talk with identities and language. So, okay, I can stop filling space now since the slides are. Okay, I'll let you talk. Thanks.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Stephanie and Stevie. And so my name is Jessie Grieser, as Stevie mentioned. I'm an associate professor of linguistics at the University of Michigan. I do not research XR, and this is actually a dearth of crossover between fields, is that we actually have too few linguists right now, I think, who are doing this work. I've been fortunate to work with a lot of students who are, though, and so just had the very new Dr. Hannah Soblow, who wrote a fantastic dissertation on Pokemon Go and its possibilities, and it's my first doctoral student who defended. this past week. And so I've had a chance to like really get into this vein of research and to identify some of the issues and questions that are related to it. So I am going to ask, and actually I'm going to see if I can, I need to pull my chat if I can. Because in an ideal world, I would be able to see my chat. Let's see. There we go. Fantastic. And hopefully I'm not covering up any of my slides. So this is going to be vaguely interactive. So please go ahead and just type anything you want into the chat just so that you know that you're here, you have your fingers on your keyboard, and you can get at that. Excellent. Here you can type your name, you can type how you're feeling, you can type what time it is wherever you are. That is 9:52 for me. Super. Okay, so what is the problem for language and XR? The problem is simply that we tend to overlook language. We think of it as something that we all do. We don't think much about it beyond that. And a lot of what we do is invisible, right? We talk about whether or not someone's voice is accented or not accented, as though there are accents that exist in isolation from their separation from other accents, right? Just ask me when I went to Washington, D.C. and had people ask what the heck I meant by a biag. That's the thing that you get at the grocery store that you put your stuff in. Some people call it a bag. I call it a biag. We tend to think about these things as being semi abstract, and we don't pay a lot of attention to the subtle differences in language until we're forced to. But these differences are all over the place. So people have different communicative styles. For instance, some of us are fast talkers, some of us are slow talkers. Sometimes you pause a lot. Sometimes people talk over each other and they don't actually mean to be interrupting. It's a way of showing that they are in line with each other and grooving with each other. Put that up against someone else who might have a different style where that's going to be viewed as interruption, and suddenly you have an interpretation of rudeness or confrontation. We have lots of ways of speaking that are associated with our gender identities or associated with our racial identities, and sometimes performatively so. So if you need to really perform, for instance, there's some studies on gay male diva persona and the use of falsetto voice. So there's some styles that are highly associated with very performative aspects of these identities. And most importantly, the way that we sound has real effects on our lived experience of the world. So this is going to be a spot where I'm going to need your chat. So let me give you some data. You can imagine whatever embodiment of these voices makes sense to you. Remember, we're thinking about XR and VR and what kinds of avatars might go with them. So you might think of it in this frame.
And it was just, all it was this preacher in North Carolina standing in the woods by a big jacked up truck, just real mad, hollering at his phone, you know.
Hopefully I passed through my sound. Can someone give us a thumbs up that sound came through? Excellent. Okay, so that was speaker 1, and I'm going to pull through speaker 2.
He wasn't even trying to be funny or nothing, and it had 15 million views, and I was just like, man, is that all it takes?
All right, so that was speaker 1, and here's speaker 2.
I am the embodiment of the American dream. I grew up on welfare, on Section 8 housing. My father was killed when I was 7 years old. I went to public schools. I went to Central Ohio, got to Howard University, and started to work in politics.
Okay, so 2 voices. You're probably starting to get a picture in your mind about who these people are. And you can type anything you'd like into the chat. What are these people like? What are their genders? What are their races? Are they educated? Are they that fiery word, articulate? What do they do for a living? What are their political ideologies? Like, who do you think these people are? Vice presidents, maybe. My students often guess that one. Male, white, for the first speaker? White man, Southern, cousin from Alabama. Okay, so this is an exercise that I actually do with my students. So educated Black woman for speaker number 2. Absolutely. Okay. This is an exercise that I do in my sociolinguistics class to get this kind of elicitation from my students and have them think about the ways that we connect our ideas about who speakers are to the voices that they have. I make them make language judgments about the voices of these 2 people. They don't get to see their faces like you are. They hear a voice that sounds female, probably Black, rings all the bells of professional. And of course, she's talking about going to Howard University. I always let them hear just a little bit of that. And they hear a voice of a younger man, probably hillbilly, kind of backwoods. They get asked about their age, their occupations, political affiliations. And here's what they usually come up with. They come up with Democrat and Republican. But if you know these 2 faces, then you might know that on the left is Omarosa Mangano, former aide to former President Trump. And on the right is Trey Crowder, the hillbilly liberal. So when liberal redneck. And so when we listen to these voices and we hear all their accent features, we hear their syntax, we hear the different aspects of their voices, we're forming all sorts of ideas about who they are, where they're from, what they believe in, and what they're capable of. These things are called language ideologies. They are conceptualizations about languages, speakers, and discursive practices, in the words of Judith Irvine. Like other kinds of ideologies, language ideologies are pervaded with political and moral interests and are shaped in a cultural setting. In short, who we are, our own experiences with language, our own experiences with other speakers are going to give us ideas about what kinds of things we should expect from other speakers in ways that may be problematic, especially when we're dealing with voices that where their body has been constructed in the sense of like an XR setting. A lot of this comes from and is situated in the very situation of the language we're using most often in just about most digital worlds, which is the language of English. I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. And if you want a really nice breezy read about English, I'll direct you to David Crystal's The Story of English. It's big, but it's worth it. It's a really breezy 1,000-word read or 1,000-page read on the English language. But English as we know it, it's mostly based on London English, which was already a prestige variety. This was the English that got exported to all of the English colonies, including here, because it was already the prestigious variety. And it also became exported right around the time that English was starting to standardize. And a major tool of that was the printing press. Prior to the invention of the press in the late 1400s, there was no such thing as standard spelling. For instance, some Flemish typesetters just got up one day and decided that since the word ghost looks a little bit like its Flemish counterpart gesta, they'd just add an H. Prior to that, it was G-O-S-T. But the Flemish typewriters just said, you know, why not? We'll just make it G-O-H-S-T. And we also accidentally invented the printing press in the middle of a sound change. So we were at the time ating mate, and they spelled it that way with the letter E, which stands for the sound A, if you know any Latinate languages like Spanish, hecho. And then while we were busy standardizing M-E-A-T to capture the word mate, we wound up changing the vowel to meat, and well, the rest is literally history. So spelling, the most stalwart thing that we might think of as, oh great, this is really standardized, we can cling to it, isn't really standard. And neither is the rest of English grammar. In fact, a lot of our senses about English grammar and a lot of the ways that we cling to English grammar rules are really the result of linguistic insecurity. So another opportunity for you to hop into the chat. What do I mean by linguistic insecurity? I'm going to show you a picture, and I would like you to, as quickly as you can, type the plural of this thing. I see octopi, octopi, octopi. octopi, octopi. Okay, if you really know the root here, you might know or might have heard that the root of this one, I like octopodes, right, is Greek. The Greek morpheme is actually octoped. And a lot of people, however, think it's fancy in some sort. They have a sense that like, okay, this isn't an English plural. And so they reach for the Latin plural octopi, as many of you did. So what's happening here is we have the thing that doesn't come from English, but by all accounts, it's an English word now, but it wasn't always. So we end up with these completing plurals for it: octopi, octopodes, octopeds. It really ought to just take the English S by now, but it doesn't, probably because we don't love puss getting an extra S. If you don't know why, go home, ask your parental figure. But anyway, these competing plurals start to mean more than just competing plurals. They start to signal that you've gotten a certain kind of education or you pay a certain kind of attention to language. So we start to cling to octoped or octopi because they say something about us, and that comes at the detriment of how we judge people who use it. However, the elevation of one variety as a standard is a reflection of our ideologies, all of those packed up information we have about whose language is good, whose language is different, whose language is accented, and whose languages are not. And it's our thinking about its speakers, not its linguistic properties. Why is this specifically a problem for XR? Part of the problem is whose voices we get. So very often when we're using data that's been trained in a large language model, NLP data is usually trained on English, and we usually use this unproblematically. We don't mention it. It's trained on the easiest English to get, which is going to replicate the kinds of problems of inclusivity and diversity that Valerie Taylor indicated at the very beginning of this session, right? Who's here? Who's in the room to begin with? This is a tweet from Emily Bender, and she has like several pieces on including our information about where our language is coming from. And she is the progenitor of the Bender rule, that all languages used in NLP data need to be stated, and we need to norm who we use. I will show you a tweet later on, also from Dr. Nicole Holliday, and she is the progenitor of the Holliday rule, where she points out that very often we ignore in our research, we leave unmarked our white cisgender men. And we need to mark each and every person the same, making clear where our data is from, who's part of it, and what these voices are doing. Why? Because there are real world consequences to the kinds of judgments we make on people's voices. So a little bit more sound data for you. Again, I'm going to ask you to listen to some voices and think about who's behind them. You can type any ideas you have about them into the chat.
Hello, I'm calling about the apartment you have advertised in the paper.
That's speaker one.
Hello, I'm calling about the apartment you have advertised in the paper.
That's speaker two.
Hello, I'm calling about the apartment you have advertised in the paper.
And that's speaker three. If you're like most people, you heard Black man, Latino man, hard to tell. Black man for number one. Latino, got Black man, Latino man. Three, possibly a white man. Certainly these are three different varieties of English. And so guise number one is African American English, guise number two is Chicano English, and guise number three is standardized white English. All of these stimuli are actually produced by the same speaker. This is the linguist John Baugh, and these stimuli are from his famous experiment work on housing discrimination. He did what's called a matched guise study. These days, we very often do them by actually phonetically phonetically manipulating the sound in phonetic software and changing its acoustic properties. He was producing all of these different guises, which of course leads to some extra layer of questions, which we can talk about in Q&A. But he produced each of these in an experiment where he was calling around to different neighborhood listings, and these neighborhoods had different populations of Black populations and Latinx populations and white populations in and around the Bay Area. And the results were somewhat predictable.
Hello, I'm calling about.
So you'll see here a graph of the neighborhoods, the likelihood that someone would accept and schedule an opportunity for Dr. Baugh to see an apartment. That's the line in black. And the white population is the line in white. So you'll notice that white people like white English, right? The higher the population of white people, generally sort of the slightly lower the slightly higher, sorry, this is white population versus standard English appointments. And so it's kind of steady. It ticks up a little bit that slightly more likely to get an appointment in a white neighborhood if you sound kind of white. But it turns out Black people like white English also. And so, yes, if you're using African American English in a neighborhood that has a high Black population, so now the white line is charting the percentage of Black population in the neighborhood. Notice that the neighborhood, it's East Palo Alto, that's what EPA stands for, with the highest Black population. It's the most likely to give an appointment to someone who sounds pretty Black, but it's still only at 80%. And neighborhoods that still have a relatively substantial Black population are still not that likely to give an appointment to a person who sounds like they are using an African American sounding voice. So whose voices we have and how and where we use them matters. You can imagine that were this not about getting houses, people might feel differently about these different guises. And in fact, we don't have to imagine them. We have studies that show this. If the construct was instead like, who do you want to hang around and play cards with, for instance? So those are things that we have to think about in the construction of augmented and virtual realities, our language situation, as well as the voices that are behind it. Okay, so what do we do? The first important thing is to assume variation. We tend to want to talk about language as though it is monolithic, as though it is a single entity, and there's some sort of standard that we are deviating from. Linguistic varieties are all exactly the same with regard to structure. A person over the age of about 5 is not going to mess up the structure of the language variety that they know. They're all linguistically equal. What happens is different kinds of variation in the grammar, in the syntax, in the phonology, the accent exist. And those things come to mean other things through those linguistic ideologies that we come up with. So we need to assume that there's a plurality, and we need to assume that people are going to react in particular ways to those kinds of varieties. In our work, as we are both recruiting participants, as we are presenting different varieties in different kinds of augmented and extended reality, we need to ensure a variety of voices are represented. We need to ensure that people hear people who sound like the liberal redneck, and people hear people who sound like Omarosa Mangano, that we hear professional class speakers and working class speakers, white speakers and Black speakers and Latinx speakers, Singaporean English speakers, right? We need to have that plurality of voices, not just a plurality of faces in extended reality. We need to understand the nature of the varieties we're dealing with. What are their structures? What are the things that make one variety sound different from another? What are the kinds of reactions that people sometimes have, right? So having a sense of this data from John Baugh and the sense of, ooh, okay, right. So we know that everybody responds better to a standardized American English accent, something that sounds very white and professional. So we need to be keeping those language ideologies in mind. And then we also need to be checking our own ideologies and thinking about the kinds of connections that we make between language varieties. And I often tell the story when I'm talking about checking my own language ideologies. My very first day at my previous position, I was at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. My very first day in town looking at apartments when I was going to go move, I was rear-ended and my old beat up Toyota Corolla that had seen me all the way through graduate school was predictably totaled because it was worth about $3,000 at the time. And I was just beside myself. I was 500 miles from the place I had lived for the past 7 years. I was thinking about giving up my whole life. And I'm listening to the insurance adjuster who's from East Tennessee and listening to his vowels and thinking, this person is not capable of handling my claim. He sounds stupid. And I realized, oh my gosh, that is ableist, northernist, classist, and I'm a linguist. So we have to be able to unpack a little bit of our own instinctual reactions. And finally, the most important thing that people can do is to partner with linguists. People think of language as being something very straightforward because we all use it in some form or another. This is how we get things like sign language gloves, which linguists have a strong hot take on. Deaf linguists have just an incandescent rage take on. A lot of what we think about language is just baked into our experience so deeply that we struggle to unpack it and to see those ideologies. But linguists only spend our time unpacking. We probably know about whatever the thing is you're running into. It'll keep you and everyone else from building things based on not great assumptions. I mentioned earlier I was going to lift up Dr. Nicole Holliday. She's another great Twitter follow. And this is literally from 2 days ago, where a team was pointing out like, hey, we're going to make a new AI that can tell whether or not you're depressed or sad or don't have enough enthusiasm in your voice. And Nicole Holliday is a researcher on voice quality. And there's lots of things that we can't tell from voices. There's lots of things that we can't unpack. There are things that don't have statistically significant differences in voice quality. And lots of these tools that are being created in very well-meaning ways. I will absolutely accede that are being done without the knowledge of, without the knowledge gained from people who are researching this stuff really closely. So check assumptions, check in with linguists, and we'll make more connections across these really important fields. So I think we are right on time and probably won't have time for Q&A now. It is 10:15 my time, and I'm planning on sticking around for the discussion at least until midnight my time, so we'll have time to talk. If you'd like to continue the conversation, I'm at jgreaser@umich.edu, or you can grab me on Twitter at jessgreaser. Thanks so much.
Yay, thank you. Great job. Yeah, we are kind of pressed for time a little bit, but if anyone has a quick question, we can maybe squeeze it in. If not, it sounds like Jesse will be around for discussion. I, of course, always have questions for you, so I look forward to that. But if no one else has a question right now, I'll turn it over to Diane, who's our keynote speaker from sort of outside the research space, but still very exciting. Would you like to share your own screen, or do you want me to share it for you? I can do either one.
I will make the attempt to share my own screen. So give me a minute. Let me see what I can, oh, wait a minute.
I will introduce you briefly. Diane, who will be speaking next, Diane Nahabedian is the executive. Nahabedian, thank you. Diane Nahabedian is the executive director of Helping Hands Monkey Helpers. HHMH was founded to raise and train capuchin monkeys to provide daily in-home assistance to people living with mobility impairments, but it's now transitioning from a service animal model to exploring scientific technologies, including different types of robotic arms, exoskeletons, adaptive wheelchairs, and assistive technologies that can make home smart, including augmented reality and virtual reality. So thank you so much to Diane for sharing her experience and her work with us, and I'll let you take it away.
Thank you very much. So before I begin, I want to do a quick exercise. I want everybody to find something on your desk or somewhere where you are, put it in your hand and lift it up over your head, just sort of stretch. Just take a quick second to do that. Just really quick, take a stretch. Okay, and do the other arm, do it really, both of them. And now I want you to think about how you got to the space you're in. Did you, not sort of how you got to where you are, you got a PhD or you, but like how you physically got to the room you're sitting in. Did you get out of bed this morning? Did you put your feet on the floor? Did you go to the bathroom? Did you take a shower? Did you physically pick up a cup of coffee? You know where I'm going with this. Did you pick up a cup of coffee, tea? Maybe some of you drank a Diet Coke, whatever, and put it to your lips. Did you get in the shower? I don't know, maybe you ran somewhere to get from one room to the other. Think about all these things. Did you physically move yourself, your whole body, to do something to get where you are physically sitting right now? I just saw Jessie pick up her mug like I'm picking up my water bottle. The folks that I deal with and that I interact with just about every day don't do almost any of those things. They need assistance every single day to just get out of bed, to be able to get to the bathroom, to get in the shower. And so I want you to keep that in mind as we have our amount of time together this morning and we talk about some of the technology we're dealing with. And I tell you a little bit about the work that Helping Hands Monkey Helpers is undertaking. I'm Diane Nahabedian, and I'm the executive director of Helping Hands Monkey Helpers. We're a 501c3 not-for-profit organization in Boston, Massachusetts. We're sort of sandwiched between MIT, Boston University, Harvard University. So we're really situated in a great place for some of the work we're doing. We are a service provider, and we are providing an enhanced quality of life for people who are living with physical challenges. But we also are constantly keeping in mind that there are caregivers that are working around the clock with family members. So this is a family situation. Somebody gets hurt or somebody has a debilitating illness. There's someone there taking care of them, a spouse, a sibling, a best friend, a lover, somebody. And so we keep that in mind at all times. And the other thing I want you to remember is that the work that you're doing directly, I hope, will continue to affect the work we're doing. And so I want to keep that in mind. I want to start by taking a large step back. I believe that the work we all do is affected by something that's happened somewhere along the line. The work that I do that I absolutely love has been very much affected by something that happened early in my life. Now, I'm not about to tell you some awful story. Actually, it's a really I came from a really wonderful, loving home, but my dad had multiple sclerosis. And so, of course, everything revolved around that. And my mom was the primary caregiver. And so, I watched this every day, and it was unlike any other. I mean, my house was unlike any other house anyway, but it was unlike any other house. My parents were first generation Americans, and, my parents thought we should be doing lots of things. But on the weekends, my mother thought my sister and I should be reading all the great volumes of Shakespeare. My father let us watch cartoons, and we would watch the Jetsons. And I thought, geez, life would be a lot easier in our house if we had a robot. I wouldn't have to clean my room. My mom wouldn't have to clean the house. And it would be really cool if we had a robot. And then we would start, on the weekend, we would start imagining, the four of us, my sister and my parents and I, well, maybe we could imagine ourselves in these exotic places. Well, virtual reality didn't exist in those days. I didn't know, but I didn't know that that was sort of leading me to this place that I have now ended up. And even though I'm not a scientist, I understand it, that the idea of having this virtual reality is the possibilities that it can change people's lives, and can change people's lives who are sitting at home feeling isolated, feeling lonely, and need the socialization is tremendous. So now I'm at Helping Hands, and now that robot and that virtual reality are real from when I was 7 and 8 years old till now. And so we're trying to do something with all of that, but how do we do it in a meaningful way, not in a condescending way? Dylan alluded to that in a lot of what he said earlier. How do you do it so that we eventually get to a point where we don't look at someone in a wheelchair, or look at someone with low vision, or look at someone who has a hearing issue and think, oh, that's awful. It just is what it is, but that we have the tools to provide people so that they can get on with life, that they can go to work, go to school, have marriages, live lives as they want to live. And based on the abstract that I read for this workshop that we're all participating, the work that you're all doing, you're building all this wonderful technology, but then there's not the time to really test it out, that it's being tested on able-bodied individuals that are 22 years old. Well, we're here to tell you we have the individuals who want to work with you who are not 22 years old, and unfortunately are not all able-bodied. So I want to give you a little bit of an idea of who we are at Helping Hands Monkey Helpers. This is what we started with 40 years ago. So in 1979, there was a woman who was working with paralyzed American veterans, and that's literally what the organization was called. And she looked around and she said, the way people who are living with disabilities are being treated is awful. It's terrible. We treat people who are living with disabilities like third-class citizens. And she started to think about how do we give people who are paralyzed a chance to have better lives. And she decided a service animal, and she decided she didn't want to work with dogs. And for some reason, she came up with the monkey. Capuchin monkeys are really intelligent monkeys. They're New World monkeys. They live in the South American rainforest. She got $1,500. She worked in a lab at Boston University, and she started to train a Capuchin monkey, and the monkey was trainable. And she started this organization, and they started breeding the monkey in-house. They worked with Disney originally, and then they started breeding and training the monkeys in conjunction with a zoo in Massachusetts. about 300 monkeys were placed with folks who have mainly spinal cord injuries and MS. Fast forward to 2019, the last monkey was placed for a variety of reasons. And I was brought in 2020 to change the model. And we are now using and building pilot projects, and technology is real. Technology is really our new monkey. It's truly against the law now to use primates in home environments. So we are no longer using the capuchin monkey. We are taking care of our monkeys until the end of their natural lives. So our new future is all in robotics and virtual reality. And we are working directly with our recipients to provide services in these new technologies. So we're bringing folks together to use the technologies with some of the companies and universities who are making the technologies. But what we're discovering is that a lot of the technology is not accessible. So we're taking a step back, and what we're saying is, well, come to us, company A, or we're working with Northeastern University, and ask us, what do our recipients need? If you're making technology that somebody can't use, then why are you making the technology? If it's for the disability community and you want them to use it, but nobody can use it, then what did you make it for? And it seems very logical the way I'm saying it, but, and don't make it if it can't be used. So we are beginning to engage and develop pilot projects where there are a number of components. The person with the disability who's going to use the technology, the company who's making the technology, coming together to say, okay, how do we do this so that in the end, the technology is usable and accessible? There's sort of something that happens when somebody is diagnosed with a debilitating illness, or somebody finds themselves with a spinal cord injury. There's a sort of a process. If you have a car accident, if you have a diving accident, if you find yourself, if you have some kind of engaged in some kind of violence, and then you find yourself in the hospital with a spinal cord injury, same thing with a debilitating illness. You go to the hospital, you end up in rehab, and then they send you home and you have to adapt. Well, that's usually where Helping Hands Monkey Helpers comes in. In the old days, we got the call and somebody would say, my son, my husband, my wife is dealing with MS, is dealing with a spinal cord injury. We'd like to get a monkey. Now we get a call and they say, are you building a pilot project? Are you far enough along in your, can we get an assistive device? And that's what we're doing. And so we are beginning to do that with folks. And that's where we're hoping that as we move along, we can say, yeah, we want you to use this virtual reality. We want you to be in this pilot project to help us, to help ABC Company to build that so that you and thousands of others are using that to make your life a lot different. The first technology that we started to uncover, that we started to work with and that we're building pilot projects around is virtual reality. We want to do 4 things. We want to inform folks who are building technologies in virtual reality to make it more accessible. We want to influence the direction that the virtual reality is going. We want to advocate for the technology. Sadly, insurance doesn't cover too much. Whether you have a private insurance, you have Medicare or Medicaid, it only covers the basic necessities. So if you say to your insurance company, well, I want to get this type of virtual reality because it's going to help my mental health. It's going to help my depression. It's going to give me more socialization. Your insurance is probably going to say no. We want to be able, through Helping Hands Monkey Helpers, to provide the technology. We provided the monkey free, and it's a fairly expensive process. We want to be there to be able to provide what our recipients need at no cost. It's pretty expensive, but that's what we've always done. That's what we want to be able to continue to do. And finally, we want to continue to be the support for the caregiver. Let me give you an example of one of the projects that we're working on. It's called the Billy Project, and it's called that because this is Billy. You see him here in the multicolored sweatshirt. Now, Billy was the last individual who got a monkey, and that's Phoebe. Phoebe, as it has turned out, is probably more of a companion than she's still a service monkey. She still will sit on top of Billy's head. Billy is paralyzed from the neck down. I think he had a motorcycle accident. Billy is 31 years old. His accident was 5 years ago. Billy was about to go to graduate school, and he worked for a technology company when he had his accident. His goal with us is to be able to influence one of the gaming companies on making the tools more accessible. So we have brought together a special effects guy in Hollywood, a gaming company, and Helping Hands and Billy. Helping Hands and Billy is the same entity. And Billy's role is to say to the gaming company, look, I love the games. I want to play the games, but I cannot put on the headset. I can't use the hand controls. What can we do to make these games more accessible? So you can see from the other picture that those three people are totally engaged in those games, but they're in total movement. So the guy in the blue sweater, his whole body is moving. He's got the Oculus headset on. His whole body is in total movement. The guy in the bottom in the brown sweater, he's opening the box. His body is in total movement. And the woman in the black top, her body is in total movement. Well, Billy can't move at all. He can't move at all, but he really likes the game. And what he says is, if I want to play a game, first, my mother has to put the headset on. Well, and Billy is a very cheery, very friendly guy. He says, but imagine being 31 and my mother has to put a headset on. He said, and then I have to play the game with my younger brother. Now, I think his brother is about his age, probably in that 28 to 31-year-old age range. And I know Billy we communicate on Zoom. And Emmett, his younger brother, is a lovely young man, but I don't blame him. Billy wants to play the game like anybody wants to play a game. And what he is saying is, I need to get this stuff more accessible. How do I do that? I can inform you, gaming company, how to make this more accessible. I can move from the neck up. So I can do it by moving my head back and forth. I can do it through eye movements. But you know, what can we do? How can we work together to do that? And that's actually a really exciting project for us. It's something completely different. It's something very new. And it's something that Billy is really, really engaged in. And he's also pretty excited that we've named the project after him. We're working with a company called SenseTech in Toronto. SenseTech was originally founded by two young men. It's a fairly new company. They originally worked with folks who had low vision. And I found them online, called them up and said, would you ever consider working with us, even though we don't do a lot of work with folks who have low vision? Everything we do is around physical disabilities. And they said, yeah, why not? So we have started this relationship. And one of the things they're looking at with us is how we train the monkey, which kind of took me aback at our first meeting, but they want to know, well, how did we know how to train a monkey to work with people who had physical disabilities? And so we have brought in our director of monkey care, who she's been with Helping Hands for about 20 years. Now she started right out of BU, and she trained some of the monkeys that were placed with individuals around the country who had spinal cord injuries. Some of those monkeys are now in retirement. They have come back to us in Boston at our Monkey Living Center, but they're really interested in what we did because they think, and I think they're right, it's going to inform how we build some of the technology that they're going to use in some of the new work they're doing at SenseTech. So it's going to be a really interesting project for us because we're going to be able to use some of the information from what we did in the past and bring it forward to the future. So that'll be a new project for us as well. We're looking at robotics. Now, this picture of this little robot is what sold our board on moving from the monkey, which we cannot train in place anymore, to moving into projects in robotics. We are working with the Institute of Experiential Robotics at Northeastern University. And they are making wonderful robotics in their lab. None of the robotics have been tested outside of the lab. So when we started speaking with them, they said, well, yeah, maybe we can try to form some kind of relationship. So we identified a couple. The husband has MS and the wife is the primary caregiver. And we have developed a project. We're looking at one of their engineers building an arm, putting it on the wheelchair of George, putting it on George's wheelchair. And George has trouble getting dressed in the morning. And he has a lot of trouble putting his own shoes on. He also has trouble when he's sitting in the wheelchair, maneuvering the chair so that he can reach his back door to get outside, to get down his ramp, to get outside to his driveway. And so we're looking at building an arm that will attach to his wheelchair that he can do all that activity. And so it'll be pretty interesting to work with Northeastern to get something out of their lab that's practical. And what George and his wife, Deborah, have said is that they will help us in any way so that other people will have the advantage. Other folks who are living with MS will have this advantage of not having to struggle the way George has had to struggle for the last 30 years living with MS. Finally, I think there are a lot of assistive devices that have dual use that are on the market. I'm sure many of you have smart homes. When you think of dual use, you think of the texting on your phone that was developed for folks who have hearing issues. Well, there are a lot of small devices that people can use that don't cost that much, or may not cost that much for some of us. But if you're not working or can't get to work and your insurance doesn't cover it and won't cover it, we want to be able to take care of that so that you can go back to work or you can get back to school. Because a $500 device could be the difference between being employed and not being employed. And so that's the other piece of all of this for us, is buying those assistive devices for people who financially cannot buy them themselves. So that's something that we've never done. Now, the final piece of all this is when we were placing monkeys in people's homes, we didn't just get a call. Somebody said, my husband had an accident and has a spinal cord injury. Can we have a monkey? We didn't just drop the monkey off and say goodbye. It was a long process. So it takes a long time to train a monkey. We would do that, obviously, but it also took us a little while to get to know the person that was calling us. And during the period when we were training and placing the animal, we had a team of social workers. And the social worker would get to know the individual and really get to know the person's personality. At the same time, the trainers were getting to know the personality of the monkey. And so it was like a matchmaking system where they would match the appropriate monkey to the individual that needed the monkey. Well, VR or robots don't have the personality of the monkey, but the individual who needs this technology still obviously has a personality and really needs the technology. But we still want to make sure that once we give somebody technology, they don't put it on the shelf and it collects dust. So we're continuing to use the same model that we used with our monkeys, so that when we give someone the technology, we're constantly going to be staying in touch like we did with the monkey. So we would give someone the monkey, we would then send 2 or 3 people out with the monkey to train the family with the monkey. So we would, the human and the monkey would get to know each other. We would stay with the family for a while, make sure everybody got along. When the Helping Hands team came back to Boston, there would be daily calls to the family for probably 3 or 4 months. Over time, those calls would end. That process will probably be similar with the technology. So we will go in, make sure the technology works, make sure we stay in touch with the person who has the technology, because we really don't want that person to feel like we just drop the technology off, plug it in and say, all right, see you later. This is a process. We want to stay in touch and make sure the person feels supported and loved, so that they know that we're here for them as they're going through the process. So in closing, as I said at the beginning, technology is our new monkey. And Hellion and Robert were our first pair. And you can see our little Hellion feeding Robert. They were a pair for 27 years. Robert eventually passed away, I think around 2007. And then Hellion passed away a few years later. But the monkey did the tasks and was there for Robert in the many years they were together. Now we have the technology, and you see George in his he's in the red shirt with his wife right behind him, and Eric in the gray shirt is the engineer from Northeastern. In the 40 years, we've come a long way, but it's still the same mission, that we're there for the person who's living with a physical disability, and we're there to support them however we can. And now it's with the technology. And what we hope is that you'll be there with us and that we can help you as you're building your technology, that we're there to help you as you look at how to make it accessible for the folks that we're serving every day. So, I know that you have lots to discuss this afternoon as you're going through. If you have any questions, I urge you to reach out. My email is dianen@monkeyhelpers.org. Please check out our website. If you're in Boston, I'll offer you something that I know most folks can't offer you. You can come and meet a monkey anytime you'd like. We can certainly arrange a monkey visit. But I really do hope that as you are building your technology, you will keep my recipients in mind and know that we are here to chat at any point, because we really do want to work with all of you, in the work you're doing. And I appreciate your you're listening and you're taking the time to hear about Helping Hands Monkey Helpers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't know if I'm trying to see is so Dylan, I think, is gone. Did you see Dylan's talk, by the way?
Yes.
So I don't know if Dylan knows that you connected up with Sherry, so I'm really glad to hear that. But sorry. Other people have questions for Diane while she's still here.
Oh, Greg, I did connect with Dylan, actually. So we had a good talk.
Awesome. That's great. Good guy.
Yeah, thank you.
Mhm.
I can jump in with the question if no one else has one. So Diane, you mentioned that specifically for the Billy project, since it seems like he's working with VR, he was focusing mostly on games. Do you have other ideas of other areas VR could potentially be helpful for the population that you help with Helping Hands?
Yeah, the Sense Tech project is probably going to be more around, I think it's going to be more around mental health, and we're still looking for other projects. So we're open to pilot projects. Billy happens to like the gaming, so that's why we built that project. But we're looking at other types. It depends on what we find. So it really depends if there are, universities or companies that are looking at VR and they say, we're looking at it specifically for healthcare, or we're looking at it for exercise, whatever they're looking at, we're open to it. I think we happened to do it with Billy because of the components we had. But we're pretty open. Yeah, we'll look at a variety of things.
Cool. Okay, well, I think if no one else has any questions right now, we can certainly talk more about all of the things that we heard this morning in the discussions. But for now on the schedule, we actually have a break until 11 o'clock. So we can transition to that, and then we can meet back at 11 and start with our discussions and hear some more of our attendees' thoughts and ideas as well. So, okay, I'll put the schedule up so everyone can see where we are. But in the meantime, everyone enjoy their mid-morning, midnight, almost midnight break. Oh, wrong screen, of course.
Thank you again, Diane and Jesse and Dylan and Ria's, I guess, gone, and maybe Valerie's gone, but thanks, guys. I'm sorry I missed your talks. I was giving my own talks. I'm sorry I missed it, but see you guys in a few.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we'll go ahead and get started. So for the latter half of our workshop, we were planning to have some discussion sessions, hopefully heavily inspired by some of the talks that we heard this morning or in the beginning half of the workshop. And we've broken this into roughly 2 parts that we conceptually can probably split up, but in practice will probably overlap a little bit. The first being things we can think about as researchers for human subjects research, what we can do when we're reviewing papers or we're starting to build relationships with the communities, especially like the communities that we heard about this morning, in terms of like the different diverse communities or folks with different identities than our own. And then for the latter half of the discussions, we'll be focusing very specifically on the participant considerations. So getting more into kind of taking in the perspective of our participants when they're coming to our study. How can we make sure we're not excluding people before they even decide to participate, getting into some of the accessibility concerns that we heard about from Dylan, about not necessarily excluding participants just because we did not design a study to be accessible from the beginning, and then how we talk about participants afterwards, and writing up data and things like that. So that will be mostly encompassed in the participant part. For this first section, the researcher considerations and perspectives, we have this again subdivided a little bit. The first part being about the first topic that you see in the discussion guide. Which I think Gerd recently shared, but I'll share it again just to be safe. The first one being good practices for inclusive and generalizable human subjects research within conference organizations. So how can we put some of these practices into play in the conferences that we're involved in? This section is pretty open, and we can talk about, kind of whatever people's interests are in. We have some discussion points to start off with, but if anyone, has anything that they particularly like to talk about, you can add it to our Google Doc or just share it on the mic. So feel free definitely to just speak up as you need to. And then, yes, so here's the shared Google Doc again. And right, so does anyone have any points of interest to add? Feel free to take a few minutes to add those to the doc. Or any reflective things from the talks earlier today as well. We can briefly recap.
One thing I've wondered about, but I'm sorry I missed Jesse's talk. I was really looking forward to that. I have to go because I know you, I think the least Jesse of the other folks. So one thing with respect to this that Steve and Garrett and others, Janine, Grace and others have talked about is, it seems to me there are at least sort of two perspectives for a lot of this. One is what is sort of structurally, what are things we might want to do? So everything from, do we just want to encourage certain things with authors? Do we want to require them? Do we want to reward them? What would that be? So like, what are the policies, procedures? And then the others really have to talk about that. And I think even to arrive at the first thing, we have to is too strong. I think we would be more likely to be successful if we can think about the right ways to approach people and to talk about them. Because in my limited experience over this past year, when I've approached certain people, generally when you get past certain things, many people are receptive to talking about it. But boy, the words seem to, despite my best efforts, seem to can be a stumbling block or worse. So anyway, I'm love to have some discussion around those things. It's one of our topics already.
Yeah, one of the things that Jesse's talk reminded me too, especially as we're thinking about, this is maybe a little tangential, but we talked about the different language ideologies and how we're reviewing papers. I think we should remind ourselves to use Jesse's phrasing to challenge our language ideologies, not only when we're reading papers and we see spelling errors and things like that, but there's also, I've encountered some where the language isn't necessarily as like inclusive as it could be. I was seeing that as a reviewer, and thinking about the balance between how to better support that inclusivity while also not being too overbearing, I guess, or too challenging, and how much of a language, I guess, imposition or something we should put into, or how much language or stylistic guidelines we should develop for these kinds of situations. There's certainly like best practices we can make about how to talk about like gender and race and things like that. But then, you know, at what point is it the researcher's responsibility to like, you know, have to familiarize themselves with all these things and like be required to do all this? Is it at the level of like the conference having to go through and check all these things? So that was probably a maelstrom of words, but hopefully there was a thought in there somewhere.
In maelstrom of words, you're an amateur. I'm a pro at that. As you were talking about this, though, I was thinking one of the things that sort of keep talking around Jesse, but one of the things we thought about Jesse was a practical thing, and it's in our, I guess it's in our notes here. I'm looking. So in the mindset of trying to focus on human subject research, one of the things that Stevie and Garrett and others and I talked about is when we're going to recruit subjects. So there's of course thinking about what is the study, what should it be, but let's assume we have a study and we want to recruit people from campus or wherever. How do we describe the study? Assume the study is okay to begin with in many ways, but how do we describe it? How do we share the opportunity with people in a way that is most inclusive, least offensive, most attractive, that sort of improves our chance? I mean, that's not a question necessarily directly for you, Jesse, but it's just a topic that we've thought about.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, a very difficult question, because one of the things that happens, I'm kind of sad to have left my former institution and left my position on our tech fee advisory board, which I walked into, and we were the university-wide board that decided how we spent the $100 or whatever that each student puts in for their tech fee, which adds up to $8 million a year, and and how we did that. And there were very few women on that committee. There especially were a few people of color, and especially women of color. And I walked onto that committee, and I wasn't sure if I was representing the faculty from arts and sciences or the faculty from humanities or who I was representing. And the person said, "Oh, no, you're the representative for the faculty of the entire university." And I said, "Well, good. I'm a millennial Black woman. I have lots of experience speaking for extraordinarily diverse groups of people that have no common interest." But I say that by means of saying, like, there's a hurdle in and of itself of getting over just the idea of anything computery, that how to phrase things in a way that allow people to think about instead like interaction, conversation, things like that, because the first response you'll get from a lot of minoritized groups are going to be, "Well, I think that's not for me. I don't have that experience," because of course people have differentiated exposure to things even now. And so yeah, I think that's probably one of the first hurdles. And then thinking about broadening the discipline and thinking about who gets invited to the table of different kinds of research, right? Like my former college boyfriend is one of the main, Jeff Blacker, he's one of the main people who works on the HoloLens, and there's a reason why the white dude from one part of Ohio is doing that, and the Black woman from another part of Ohio is a sociolinguist.
Wait, sorry, I'm dead, so I missed that. Why is there a reason for those two?
In terms of like sort of we also have ideologies around who belongs in what discipline, who gets to be a tech person and who doesn't, and those sorts of things.
I see.
We have that problem within linguistics. We were having a big Twitter discourse the other day about how linguists of color often get pushed out of the, like, not put, like, encouraged sort of more in the direction of sociolinguistics and doing the kinds of work that I do, which I love doing. But there are very few linguists of color who are, for instance, theoretical syntacticians, because people kind of go, well, but don't you want to be doing work that is about like uplifting Black people? Well, like, no, I want to like, I mean, I don't want to, I don't like theoretical syntax, but you know, there's nothing inherent about being a minoritized scholar that means that someone does not want to spend a whole bunch of time thinking about WH construction in a dialect of Turkish. But that's not where people send people.
Yeah, one of the first things you said a moment ago that is really new to me. I love the, like, awakenings or discoveries. I just, it hadn't even struck me before that when we recruit subjects for study, that sort of techie aspect of it, like that we would word things in a way that people who know what, say, VR is, and they see that and they go like, oh yeah, I want to do that. And people who don't will just probably either not understand it or not be interested or whatever. I'm not sure, but it just never occurred to me that that could happen.
I mean, even the various terms for, you know, most people, in my experience, have had a lot of relationship with virtual reality and they have a sense of what that is. But, you know, when I talk about the fact that I'm working with graduate students who are thinking about diversity issues in augmented reality, and people go, well, now what's augmented reality? And that's kind of the response I get from other English professors and linguistics professors, which is interesting. And so there's some bridges to cross.
There's a
Valerie
weird,
go ahead.
Yeah. No, I was gonna say there's sort of a weird, I don't know, there's so many considerations. So one of them, I guess, I think is, it's a practical one, and maybe the IRB would, any IRB might not be happy to hear this, but there's a bit of a competition for eyeballs, right? It's like everybody who might participate in a study is doing a bazillion things. They're being asked to do a bazillion things. They're presented with a bazillion opportunities. And so it's like, how do you snag that? So part of the language, I mean, that's one of the things we might all think about. It's like, we want them to come to our study because, you know, otherwise they're going to go through everybody else's. We're not going to get the subjects we need. So how do you do that without being disingenuous isn't the right word, but you know, in a way that is not wrong, quote unquote, and is not too techy, and it's like, wow. I mean, it can't be too vague, right? It has to be concrete enough that they know what they're getting into at some point. It can't just be come have a conversation or come look at some stuff. And then they're going to show up and be surprised at what they're being asked to do or whatever.
I can also add that in thinking about this in psychology labs, you know, one of the things that's come up is it's the language being inclusive on people believing that they, you know, shouldn't self-select out because of the type of experiment that it is, but also the language being very clear that you'll be flexible in the timing. So, you know, a lot of students at our university work full-time, and so they self-select out because they're like, I can't do this when I'm on campus, I'm busy and I'm getting stuff done, and like, I don't want to come back, you know, at a time that's inconvenient for me. So also feeling like the language is inclusive in terms of we will let you participate whenever you are available, work with your schedule kind of thing if you want to do this, is also hard to figure out how to convey, but it has been found to be helpful, I think, in just making anyone feel more included if they also have a different socioeconomic status and have other requirements for financial reasons.
In practice, how does that work? Can you give an example, Janine? Is it like you say from noon to 6 p.m. just show up?
Or you say, if you're interested in, you know, if you're interested in volunteering or participating in the research for pay or whatever, here's an email, contact us to schedule a time that works with your schedule kind of thing. So being really, and it really takes a lot of research assistants and graduate students to be available and open, but that's how you're going to get the really different groups of students that can't normally participate. Or the alternative is to do things online so people can do it whenever they are free. Right, but that's a little bit, thinking about that a little harder with VR technologies unless you know, had things available to them to send home or whatever.
I wonder if, I mean, it strikes me that there are at least three from a time perspective. So we're talking about that, which is interesting. I never thought about that either. To me, it's interesting. So one is we do like usually I think Sign Up Genius or something. We actually schedule slots, and so I could just never. I mean, I could sort of imagine. I think I have imagined it myself. It'd be hard for me. It's like, you know, commitment. You sign up. You got to work around everything else, and stuff comes up. You can't make it. But there is that. So I schedule a time slot. There is call me, send me an email, and I'll one-on-one and figure out with you a good time. And then there's maybe an in between. Are you aware of anybody who says, look, this whole day till 10 p.m. will be open for business? Anybody who can make
or
it
the
over there and come by?
weekends,
Or the weekends? Yeah, so some periods of time. But in addition to sign up slots and one-on-one, could that work? Would people do that? Is that improper in some way?
I mean, I can say that in running children in our lab and in running in VR and in running older adults, we've had to be really available. Because it's like, when can your parents bring you in, right? So there's this whole other person involved. And if you want to be inclusive of kids, you got to work around people's schedules, right? And being creative and thinking of things like, drop 3 kids off at a time and we'll be your sort of babysitter kind of thing, right? So then alleviating the parents a little bit and letting them go grocery shopping or something else, right? For a parent that works full time too, or works 2 jobs, if you want, you know, different types of SES, then you have to think through these things and providing something that's helpful to them in the process. But yeah, older adults too, like some of them are like, I'm really early morning person. I'm up at 5 a.m. Can I come at 6? Because there's no traffic and there's no this and that, you know, so it's like, and we're often like, we'll try to make it work because we want to be as inclusive as possible. But it takes we have a lot more research assistants because of it. And they also have different time pressures. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but trying to be inclusive, I think, involves thinking about these things.
I was just laughing because I was thinking to myself, I mean, all these things are going through my head, like in the wild study. So like going to a shopping mall and setting up a kiosk and just allowing people to come through, whoever's there. And then in my head, I was thinking to myself, oh, instead of giving them money, you could say, it doesn't ever work, but it's funny. Like, oh, we'll watch your kids for 30 minutes while you get to just go shop and do whatever you want.
You would not believe how much more appealing that is to parents. Yeah. Right. So also, I think that is part of it, right? Is like figuring out what is the currency like that is the most important to them, right? Maybe like paying people isn't always the most inclusive thing either, right? Just depends.
I wonder if there's some research into that, like trying to figure out, like running a comparative study. If we do this, then we get more diverse participants. If we do that, then we don't. Or maybe you should run a study like that. Just do the same. Maybe don't even do anything in the lab. Just studying the way we get people into the lab.
One you can schedule whenever you want, and the other you can't. It would be a really interesting experiment to then look at the diversity of participants on many.
You know, one of the things about that, though, for me, and you just said this, Janine, it's like I'm going to be negative just for a minute, not because I'm negative, but just because to make a point. It's like that is really time intensive and energy, and just like the overhead of doing that is, as you say, really difficult. I wonder if someone could have like I don't know if I'd call it a clearinghouse. I wonder if there was like a organization or group or people who would serve to coordinate for multiple studies for different people, like on the campus. Let's just say for a university for the moment. So it's like a campus student subject officer, something like that. And they could be in places, CTRU, what is that, Grace?
And typically, most universities have a clinical trial research unit where they will charge per participant. And that's like the central location where they run protocols for hundreds of participants. And, it might be whatever, like public health typically uses a CTRU for their large scale clinical trials, but they'll do everything from screening, they'll set up the time slots. It has a full facility with staff members who are able to sort of cover a very, very wide time range. And if you are at a large university, I would say most of these universities will have some similar form of a CTRU unit. And so it's a little bit more overhead. So I believe like they'll charge, the recent quote that I got was like $50 per participant, for example, and say that you want to run through 200 participants, and they'll have like criteria, exclusion criteria, inclusion criteria. They'll do the screeners, they'll, go through the protocol with you, and they'll conduct the actual study, the implementation for you.
So that's specific to some sort, it doesn't have to be, but in practice, those are biomedical or medical in terms of
Usually, because a lot of these clinical trials are conducted in public health or biomedical schools, they tend to do these, large scale, like NIH R1 type of studies. But I mean, they're open to any faculty member, I believe. And they will work with faculty members' needs to kind of fulfill whatever it is that you need for your data collection.
So I wonder more generally, I'm just brainstorming. Like, so maybe this is sort of veer, like, I'm just, what if someone was on campus somewhere, so outside of medical context, just general campus, set up a table, and if you had like kind of an open house kind of thing for study participants. So just let people walking by stop and ask, or you sort of get input from them, like, would you do this? What's a barrier to you? Are you interested? What sorts of things are important to you? And just try to learn from them in different contexts. So the table here, this there, do it online, do it in maybe a variety of different ways. I myself, it's sort of like, I don't tend to think that way, because right, you got to study. I need 25 people. Give me 25 people and let me get on with my life. I wonder if that's sort of a Vera-like investment in kind of maybe like Garrett's saying, but not just study, you could do both at the same time, but building awareness maybe on your campus, for example, and also building awareness both ways. So that as we as researchers become more aware of what the students and other people are, maybe if you go to a shopping mall, what's important to them, what time is like, and certain things like that, and then also making them aware of the opportunities to do things.
Well, we're talking about recruiting. This might not be a bad place to transition to some of the community-based research topics that you had prepared, Grace. If you have any you'd like to jump in with, because I think Dr. Welch is almost describing like the inverse of that.
Yeah, no, I was just going to, because I guess we're a small enough group at this point, and a lot of the keynotes were super fascinating in terms of just considering the diversity and inclusiveness of the participants that we work with. But when we conduct community level interventions, I think the biggest issue that we come across is that because a lot of the communities that we work with tend to be sort of the underserved, marginalized populations, we're always trying to figure out what it is that we can do to reduce their burden, and for this to be a more of a long-term relationship rather than we swoop in, get the data, and then bye-bye. Like, what is it that they are able to benefit from instead of us sort of, getting what we need for the research and then moving on with our life. And so I think that was one of the things that I didn't really hear covered specifically in the discussions or in the keynotes. And I would love for us to be able to sort of brainstorm, because I haven't been able to figure out something that works well. And it's always almost an ongoing, not like a contention, but more of a, a thinking point as we go through a lot of these community level interventions. Like how is this sustainable? Because I'm pretty sure that these communities are tapped into many, many times throughout the year.
Yeah, and it's definitely an interesting problem from what I understand, because once you establish or there's kind of like the trade-off of like making the connection with the community, at least for some of the studies that we run, we don't necessarily want like the same participants in every study, because there's the buildup of familiarity with the technology, which sometimes we may want, sometimes we may not. May not be part of what we're studying. So like the concept of like overtaxing a particular community or having them overrepresented at the opposite end, it's a delicate balance for sure.
Yeah, especially let's say when you have a funded project and the funding ends and the project ends, the team disperses, for example, and then what is left between the researchers and the community members who were a part of that project? Because typically the interventions will have some technology, some form of, we're going to go in with VR headsets, and this is the experience that we have that we're testing the efficacy for. And then after the 2-year, 3-year, 5-year mark, and then what happens? Like, do they get to continue to use this technology, or what happens when the technology phases out and they have no way of upgrading or maintaining the technology that was introduced to them?
It's kind of like we almost need a model similar to what Diane was talking about, where we have the support provided to our so-called monkeys out in the wild to suddenly like withdraw it, or like, sounded like they have like kind of the gradual tapering off of the check-ins and things like that. But yeah, thinking more about the long-term relationships and how we set those up.
Do you think, so one of the things I was talking about, Jeanine, I think you said you maybe saw part of my talk this morning, but we've talked about this before too, but the value of, I mean, nothing's perfect. So there, and I'm also a fan of, there's no silver bullet. We got to try lots of different things, or whatever might work, but try them all. I wonder if so I think there's a lot of value in if communities that already exist, and maybe, I don't know what to call them, representatives or liaisons or people who are permanent, who are part of that community, maybe grown-ups, so representatives who are who could be interfaces to those communities over a longer time to work with us and others on campus. So maybe not 20 different organizations, somehow make it efficient for them and not a burden for them, but useful to others. So like if we had a community on campus, something like even our DEIA office on campus, I wonder if we could just establish a relationship with them where we just make them aware of the things we're doing and see if there's interest on their part or in the students and people that they work with and getting involved in some way. I don't know. I'm just trying to figure out. I mean, we can't go to every individual everywhere. We just can't do it. We're not the right people to do it. I speak for myself. I don't know how to do it. It's logistically crazy. So if we could find those like satellites with people who we could work through, I wonder if is that a thing? Do people do that?
I know that the university extension offices typically have agents who are sort of established within the local communities, and they do a lot of the liaison work. But even so, I think, because I was just posed with this question for a grant that I'm working on with the coastal residents, the coastal communities of Georgia. And it's a great intervention, but their question with the National Weather Service offices out on the coast were, what happens at the end? Because we're getting to the end of the second year when the project is supposed to end. And so, it's like, well, this is a great educational platform, but the VR technology will age out really quickly. So in 6 months, year, 2 years, it'll be completely obsolete. Then what do we do with this? Like, how is this sustainable? And it's impractical for researchers to offer anything above and beyond our funding sources, right? It's very difficult for us to be like, oh, we'll dedicate certain resources for you to support this for the next 5 or 10 years. And so the handing off, the transitioning from where we are, we demonstrated that this works, it's highly efficacious and increasing X, Y, and Z, and then transitioning that off to the local offices so that they're able to work with it to a certain extent is going to be key. But typically the research grants end right before the transitioning happens. And so this has been sort of our biggest challenge that we're currently dealing with at a day-to-day level. And like, these are valid questions, right? Like when you get them, you're like, yes, these are completely valid questions and valid concerns, but I'm not sure if there is a practical solution to make all the key stakeholders happy. So I don't know if you you have any creative solutions, or if you've had successes or something worked for you, but would be interested in hearing.
I don't. I'm just feeling the same thing.
Yeah,
you know?
it's hard because I think we're just starting to really get involved with outside of the laboratory participants, and we're sort of, opening that horizon, but realizing that these are real people and we can't just leave them with being research participants.
Mm-hmm. The only thing that I know of that I worked on that we were kind of able to sustain without like continual funding specifically for that was I worked in Dr. Benjamin Locke's lab, and we had a virtual patient medical communication skills trainer, but it was online. So it was just a website, and you can talk to like a virtual patient there. But it was a website, which meant, everyone had the hardware to access it. We could, offer it as a it's not going to work perfectly, but any medical educator that wants to use it, we can do our best to support your use of it in however way you would like to incorporate in your learning. But then it wasn't dependent on funding. It was kind of like a mix of a lot of different people's dissertations in the end, but it was not hardware dependent. So that was, I think, one of the big things, and which meant lots of different people could use it with stuff they already had. So that's definitely the challenge.
So one of the things Ben does that I always find interesting, Ben's a fascinating guy, but he, I've not thought about this for so long now. I have to get it back into my head. I have to retrieve it from long-term storage. Let's see. So Ben, help me, Stevie. Ben he's done this community-based sort of like public service. He did a sabbatical where he stayed back, it was a year or two ago, I guess before the pandemic.
The VR for Social Good initiative?
Yeah, VR for Social Good initiative. But one of the things that I thought was interesting out of that was these periodic interactions with the community, and then it is getting a little off topic of the workshop, who cares? So that, to Grace's point, that so as we were talking about this and everything you were saying, Grace and Stevie, I was thinking about students and student volunteers, and I was thinking about the energy and the passion there, and sort of like wanting to do something and having energy, and I don't know about time, but Ben would like find the pool, the students who are interested in doing something, find the organizations or community people who had a need for something, and then would sort of marry them up, and those students would work with those people for a while to do something. So the thing that was permanent was the structure that brought in the students who were there at that time, who were willing and able to do something. And it's a place where the community people could go, sort of one-stop shopping, and place, it's not, there's just no one, but a place they could go and present their needs. So Grace, if it's somebody who says, oh, these researchers, this professor on dumped all these headsets on us and then they left, and
and then what do we do?
What do we do? It's built into our curriculum, but we don't know how to doesn't turn on anymore, whatever. I don't know, you know, that's like,
Yeah.
but I don't even know who, it's a rhetorical question, who funds that? You know, is it, you know, like, so there's Ben, or who fund, it's not just money, but who money equates to who spends the time and can make it work. And so Ben does, you know, he did out of a sabbatical, and I don't know how he pays for it otherwise.
We have similar, yeah, because we have similar setups where we call them service learning projects, and students get involved with the community and, you know, work with the community to resolve any issues that they might have. But the problem with that is that the topics jump around every semester, and so there's no continuity. And in terms of the community members, like we did everything we were, you know, we thought was good. And so we were diverse and inclusive and went to the underserved communities, and then found out that there is no way for them to sustain this. They don't have the same resources that other communities might have. And so then you're kind of like, well, now we have a conundrum. So this is sort of a very practical and ongoing question that, you know, we have to grapple with. Like, once we get this up and started and everybody's excited and they have, you know, buy-in, and then what? And fortunately, one of our NIH projects was initially funded for 5 years, and we have a 2-year extension. So we've been able to extend it out for 5-6 years. But then once the funding runs out, then what, right? And so every time like the DEI stuff comes up, that's sort of the tension where like there's no bridge between the researcher and the community members, and it's a very practical problem that we're having. And so the initiatives are great and the students are excited, but I'm wondering, where do we go from here now that we've ventured out from the laboratory into the communities?
So I like one of the things sticks with me, Garrett said earlier, and, you know, talking about shopping malls and stuff like that, and tables in the university common, like the union or whatever. I wonder, getting, you know, heading a little bit back toward the topic of the workshop, I wonder if, am I just ignorant that I don't know that this has already been done? But I'm imagining weeks of just setting up a table staffed by students, or periods of time where we just, maybe it's a study where we pay subjects who come by and spend 10 minutes with us, or 15 minutes, and we try and understand from them, are there barriers? Would they participate in other studies? So it's like a meta study. So like studies, why aren't you involved in the study, or would you be involved in the study? What's a barrier? What are your interests? What matters to you? Timing, whatever it might be, money, all those sorts of transportation, whatever it might be, all those things, and just try and build up some knowledge that
I think that would work, but I think the problem is the same barriers that exist for them coming to the lab will exist for them stopping to talk to you.
So maybe you'd have to do it many different ways. So
yeah, you know, like it's all time as a commodity for a lot of these students, and you have to, you know, kind of think about it that way. So the question is like, and also it's just students you're getting. So I think some of this comes back to like, what's the research question you're trying to answer, and is it really important for you to have a really diverse group of respondents to answer your question? And, you know, obviously I would say anybody could say you want to have the most diverse group for any study you ever run, but, you know, as you are pointing out, this is often not completely feasible for every study that you're going to run. So you might want to prioritize this for some research questions where you really care about this, and other research questions could get by.
I'm talking about the sort of meta legwork or work that sets you up to do that, if I understand what you're saying. So I said student union or whatever, just as a example, but imagine you go to the shopping mall too, or go as many places you can think of. Maybe send email, I don't know, maybe it's social media, but try to gather. I wonder if you could identify venues and needs so that you could better target places when you then later go to recruit. Because
So
right
I
now,
mean, I
we
don't like if you guys have ever written an NIH proposal, you have to write all of this in. You have to say, I'm going to go to this part of the city that has this type of population, and I'm going to try to make a connection with the community there, or go to the churches, or go to the community centers. Like, you really usually say much of this and try to set up getting recruitment from these different places. But these barriers.
Jesse, do you want to jump in with how you connected with the church community leaders? I thought this was so interesting, especially since you know, a lot of what we're talking about is like lab-based studies, whereas from what I understand, the work Jesse did was definitely not in a lab. So
yeah, although I do lab work, and so that's kind of, I'm also thinking about that perspective.
What was that? I'm sorry, I missed it. What can you tell me quickly?
Yeah, so I didn't talk about it in this talk, but the bulk of my work for the last 11 years, 2011, 2022, yep, has been in a community study in Washington, D.C. And a big part of that was going into the community first through the official channels and kind of going, okay, who are the community leaders? And I wound up, and I think what Stevie's remembering is like, I wound up at this Black Catholic church, I think in part because I was a graduate student at Georgetown. And so I had contacted several pastors, and one of the pastors got back to me because he's like, oh, you're a good Catholic person at a good Catholic college. I am not Catholic, but I happen to go to Catholic high school, which turned out to be a really important research skill.
You knew the secret handshake.
I knew the secret handshakes. I could get my way through a mass, and so I could. And so I did a lot of recruiting there. Yeah. And so I got people, got a chance to contact with people. I think another aspect of that too is giving back. And so I think in some respects, especially when we're talking about XR with disabilities, which I really liked the focus on that in this panel, and learning from our colleagues who are doing that kind of work. But when I took, and now I'm going to feel really bad because I've failed to follow up on actually getting copies of my book to the people in this community, in part because I felt bad, because even though my book's pretty cheap and I tried to get it published pretty cheap, it's still $30, which is more than a lot of seniors on like Social Security can afford. So I'm planning to just ship them a case of books, and I need to do that at some point. But I went back to one of the community centers where I'd interviewed a lot of seniors who are part of this city-funded seniors group, gives them something to do during the day. They often go places and get hot meals, which they need, and things like that. And I took my book back when it was done. And of course, it took about 5 years from the time I had started to develop those relationships, and COVID had happened, and all of those sorts of things. And the director of the seniors group said, you know, it's funny, we get asked to be in all of these studies and groups, and, you know, and to do research and participate in surveys that people want our opinion, and you're the first person who brought back the results. And I was just floored.
I mean, something I'm not afraid to say I'm, you know, human or whatever, that I don't know. I mean, I think Janine, Grace, you guys have maybe talked about that before. It's something I just never occurred to me. Not because I'm a bad person, it just didn't enter my head.
No, I mean,
that would even be a thing.
Yeah, when we have done work like local school systems that we've partnered with, one of the things we always do is run the kids and then tell them we're coming back in 2 weeks to present on what, and we're going to have all your data and we're going to show you the results. And you know, they can be quite young, but they're still into it because they did the experiment, so they understand kind of what they were doing, you know. But I think that is the most important thing, that you just really show back up to educate people about science, right? Because they'll be more likely to continue to collaborate with you if they know there's a good working relationship.
There's also and Vera, we've thought about this too, but there's the citizen scientist sort of mentality that they can be a part of it.
Exactly. Yeah.
You might want to explain Vera for folks who aren't familiar.
Oh, so yeah. So who's not familiar? Jesse, others. So Vera is it's an NSF, it's a system, virtual experience research accelerator. Jesse or anybody else, have you ever heard of PSA, Psychological Science Accelerator? Janine, you know, right? Maybe? No?
I mean,
Yes.
I've heard of accelerators.
I know Valerie, if she was here, because Valerie's the one who connected us in the project up to PSA. Anyway, Vera is acronym for a human machine system, mechanical Turk-like. If I said that, I don't know if Jesse, you know what mechanical Turk is. But for human subject research. And it's a subject of a proposal to the National Science Foundation for a four-year award to build a system that puts in place a panel, if you will, or pool of participants around the country that's diverse and general diversity, but then also some specialized populations. We have relationships with Look At, or Children Helping Science at MIT, so children, family, some organizations that work with the elderly, and some other groups, headband manufacturers and everything. So the idea is that researchers, if this was in place, general researchers like Greg could submit a proposal to run a study. It would get run, boom, it would get pushed out to 1,000 participants around the country, their head mounts. They would go to a list and say, oh, I'm going to do that one. They would do the study, they would answer the questions, do whatever they did, and then all the data would come back to a centralized place, and we'd be able to then, process it, analyze it, look at it. And then if we made a mistake, kind of like mechanical Turk, if we wanted to run it again with a slight variation, we just push out the study again with that variation, or do and the idea is that the participants would be permanent. They would be longitudinal. So they're around, they're a part of the organization. They feel like they're a part of the organization. So there's a balance, right? You want them to remain objective, and you don't want them to, to be biased in some way. And there's a question of expertise and developing experience and things like that. But so all of that has to be managed. But yeah, it's still part of the goal is that they are like citizen scientists in a sense, or that they're part of the team, that they don't feel like they're just being used or just paid to do this task, but that they understand that they're a part of this and this larger enterprise of science where people are trying to understand or discover things better. So I other people thought about this forever, not me. So for me, it's kind of fun to think about, intriguing to think about relationships in that way. But whether it's just going back to the school with the kids and sharing with them, or whether it's something longer term, that is something I wonder if it's like, do we even, this is sort of rhetorical, but it's literal. And I know the answer, Garrett, the answer is no, but do we ask our participants, do you want to see the results? I don't think we ever.
You can totally do that. That's definitely something that's possible, right? Or just write down your email or tell us how to get the results to you, right? In some way that we could mail it to you or whatever, if they don't have email, if they're older or something. But one thing I was going to say that I was thinking of when Grace was talking about, what to do with this kind of quandary of what do you do when these things are over, and also kind of relates to Jesse being on this technology committee, because I'm on the same committee at the University of Utah. I'm like one of the only ones ever that's ever done any computer sciencey type of thing. And, kind of, oh, you should be on this committee. And there's a lot of student dollars that we are spending for education and learning. And one of the things that's come up is the libraries have not much to do anymore now that everything is digital, right? They've moved all the books. They've got all this space, right? That's a whole other thing. But I think this is happening in all types of libraries, not just on university campuses. So one of the things that has grown out of that is that we have this library staffed with VR technology people now, and we have VR tech areas and classrooms that students can use. And you could imagine if this was like a community library, partnering with them longer term, and you'd have some buy-in for funds, right, to keep the technology more current. You'd have possibly some buy-in for some tech staff, which has been really great for us to have these people also on campus that we can work with. And you could imagine running people coming in from the community through these studies if they could give you a space, right? So maybe you kind of try to think about centering it around libraries in some way that also get a wider swath of the community coming through them.
So this
Usually.
goes back to a language thing. How do you approach them? Hey, you guys are like, nobody cares about you anymore. You have lots of space and nothing to do.
It still comes back to how do you make them feel included. But I think VR is this cool thing where when you see people doing it, you're just sort of intrigued. Like, what is that? Some, maybe the barrier is not quite as high. I don't know. Like, people are just intrigued by it.
Yeah, so for our coastal community study, we've partnered with their local aquarium where all the K through 12 students come through. And so we'll be donating our VR headset and computer so that they can use it as a kiosk. And that would be a part of the outreach. And so, we're trying to be creative, but I love the library idea too.
I was going to bring up that as an example. There's a fabulous linguistics lab inside the Columbus Science and Technology Institute, and they do, and it's a little bit of the we'll babysit your kids kind of aspect to it, because they sometimes will take kids in and they're participants for like 30 minutes at a study, and their parents can wander around and go get a cup of coffee or something. But then the kids are excited because they're doing science at the Science Museum. But then you wind up with this much more diverse population in a lot of different ways. I mean, of course, still limited by the people who can afford to go, but
think to go or whatever.
Yeah. But I mean, I think these are just amazingly important points that I think research institutions don't really teach you, and you sort of have to learn along the way. Like, you need to have line items for budgeting things like babysitters. We have pizza, like we feed the kids, like we'll take them, we feed the kids, we'll look after them, come back in a couple hours. And that way they don't have the double burden of participating and losing income, because most of these people are like 2 shifts, 3 shifts, that, both working parents. Typically the parents don't even come to pick up their kids from the after school program. Like, they have friends in the neighborhoods, uncles, aunts. I mean, the family structure is very diverse. And so we didn't know at the get-go to budget these items in. And we're like, well, where do we get the babysitters? Where do we get the pizza? And so these things, I think research institutions need to know how to teach their grad students, I think, even like from when they're young, to be cognizant that your lab studies are not the only way that you recruit people and collect data. And like for me, that learning curve was really steep. And it would be great if students are able to learn about these things as they learn about social science in general too.
It's not that I wouldn't want them to learn.
Oh, I was just saying it's a different kind of research methods.
Mm-hmm.
I was gonna say it really, it's not that I wouldn't want them to learn, but I'm just like, it's not just it's so inefficient, but if if everybody has to do that, if every researcher has to teach their grad students figure it out, they learn, they go, they fumble, they do all this stuff, and then they get some data, and then they graduate, they go away, and the next students go on, they do it all over again. And but it's also the recipients or the populations of people are like, this person's coming to me now, this other person, and they're asking me the same questions, and I'm getting hit left, like all over. So it's like, I don't know what the answer, if there's an answer, but I mean, is it something like the university, just pick university for a moment, has like an office or a place that researchers can work with, and that office, it's permanent, and maybe they pay for it, maybe they pay something for their services, but the university office, it's not just campus people. I mean, it's just, I'm saying university because it has to be, the people who do this have to be somewhere. So let's say they're at the university, but they know local populations, they know places where people go, they know the mall, they know the community centers, they have relationships with all these people. So they're like the sort of clearinghouse. So researchers, you could go to them and say, here's what we'd like. And they can say, okay, well, you can go here and here, and we'll coordinate this with those people because we know them and they know us, and it won't be a waste of their time. And does that happen anywhere? Is there like a clearinghouses for like the thing you said, whatever the acronym was, Grace, but more broad.
CTRU.
Yeah, I'm terrible with acronyms. Yeah, but more general, like campus. I don't know what general means. I guess I'm being selfish. When I say general, I mean something I could use. That's me. That's what I mean.
I feel like it's definitely a practice in industry because you see plenty of positions for research coordinators who just work on recruitment. And that's all they do for like user experience studies.
Mhm.
I mean, I think about like UCF, and UCF loves their system. So it's so easy to say, oh, we'll pay for license for Sonas or whatever it is. And it's like, you know, it's a system people can sign up and do studies. So that's the easy, sort of the easy way out and cheap. And I'm not saying it's bad, it's a good thing if it happens, but it's like setting up an office or someone who does that, that would be hard. And I don't know how it would pay for itself, because that's something UCF to worry about. And I mean, it's something you have to think about, right? How would that work? Would we as researchers, like I said, pay that office something for the subjects they help us get? How do they justify their existence? How do they get paid? Is it the state decides? Because it ain't gonna happen in Florida. But so how's that
Yeah.
organization gonna survive?
I mean, this reminds me a lot of that unfunded grant that we wrote, Greg, about the organizational memory. And the people who are involved in community research have so much accrued knowledge that sort of, you know, falls through the cracks when they leave the field, or, you know, there's direct immediate students might know, but the entire discipline doesn't learn from this particular person's accrued knowledge. And so that's, I mean, I feel like it's a lot of waste, right? Like Jesse has amazing stories, Janine has amazing stories, and you know, all these people have experiences that are really valuable for the field and rarely gets, I guess, distributed.
And if you had that,
oh, go ahead, Greg.
No, I was gonna say, if you had that institutional person or office and they were the institutional memory and they persisted over time, then even new grad students, you know, part of their training where they would be to go to that office, to those people and work with them to learn, how do I interface with these populations? And they would help them do that. So it's learning, it's leveraging and preserving that knowledge in that office, in that place, of those people, and then sharing it or help facilitating things. Janine?
So I don't know if it's helpful, but the only time I've seen this, exactly this, what we're describing in my career, is when we worked with anthropologists to go to field sites to collect data with participants all over the world. And they do a very good job, and it is cultural to their field. They do a very good job of cultivating. It takes their whole career, right? Relationships with these places that they go to observe people, collect data, whatever. And they take their grad students very early on to preserve the lineage, right? So that, and it is very much like if this person made this connection, it's that lab's whole lineage that has the connection long term. And if you want to go to that area, you have to go through those people kind of thing. And they have relationships with governments. It's absolutely crazy, but it's exactly what we're describing. And it's very much built into the whole training model that they have in anthropology, if you think about like field site work. And that is kind of like what we're talking about. It's a different way of it's just think of the community as being a different field site, right? Than the lab participants that we are so easily able to, you know, collect from.
Yeah, because I think for us, a lot of that effort is very fragmented. And so if you're lucky, then you have access to this. But if you're not, then you never see the light of day.
You don't see it, and you never get in unless you're working with someone who already has these connections. That's right. Yeah.
So Vera isn't the answer for everything, but as we're talking about this, you know, imagine that was in place. If you had, let's say at UCF or wherever, had an office where people were doing this, or some population somewhere, if they were plugged into Vera, then their expertise, their knowledge, that community gets leveraged maybe both ways to lots of other places, not just to that local geographic community.
But that's the point. Yeah.
And it becomes even much more impactful or efficient. But I guess I'm still trying to think, but in the nearer term, So you guys, nobody said anything. You guys would know, like I said, much more than me. Is there, is there, is there a thing where you would do sort of a next step, which would be to really not do a study, but do a study about studies? I don't know if I'd call it a study about studies, but do some information gathering, which is like go to different places and just talk to as many people as you can through many different mechanisms as you can and find out. I guess you'd have to limit the domain. So let's just say it's XR kinds of things. Like, would you do it? What's important to you? Schedule. Try to learn as much as you can from different people and organize that, like in terms of this population, these places, we learned this, and demographics, children, whatever it might be, and sort all that out. Is that, I guess that's must be done somewhere.
I mean, for most of the funded work, the clinical work that we do, we always tend to begin with sort of the front end evaluation and focus groups and have interviews with key stakeholders, participatory research design type of a thing, so that we're able to even know where to begin and what these people think, what's the baseline, so get sort of a calibration of the population that we're going to work with before the intervention even happens. And so is that something that you were referring to, or is this on
maybe something like that? But I'm thinking longer term. I'm thinking like, and again, I don't know how it happens, but you have to do that every time. I have to do it if I want to do it. Janine, we all have to do it every time. We start all over from scratch. We reinvent the wheel. We fail the same way. We spend a huge amount of time and effort, and probably are very bad at it. At least I would speak for myself. So it's like we don't even get the opportunity to practice and learn because, but like you said earlier, Grace, like the grant's done. Like I'm just starting to figure stuff out, and I'm done. I gotta move on to the next thing. So I don't know what I'm looking for, but I wonder, I mean, is it ethnography? Is that the right field? Is that the sort of person who would go in and study like all these different populations, and I guess not study them for what they are, but be somebody who would study them for figuring out like how could they be involved? How could these populations be involved in human subject research?
This kind of ties into the workshop paper that I submitted for a different workshop at ISMAR this year. I was talking about how there's a lack of the use of the term generative research in academic research, academic extended reality research. So by that, at least in user experience industry, people tend to use that as like exploratory research or things like Grace was saying about setting the groundwork, understanding community, but really for this in particular, understanding the perceptions of the community about a particular piece of technology. And from what a very brief skim of the literature that I did for the workshop paper, people don't really talk about if they're doing that research, they're not talking about it in a way that denotes it as kind of this exploratory stage or this ground laying or foundational stage. So if people are doing that sort of thing, they're not talking about it in a way that's sort of setting it up for a broader understanding of how people perceive the XR technology.
I guess what I'm thinking or wondering about is even less just stepping back a little bit from sort of research, but thinking just more practical, like understanding what are the practical concerns of these populations and trying to be better at approaching them and seeking them out and giving them opportunities that fit with them and not redoing that every time. Every time we go.
I mean, wouldn't that be more of a moving target though? I wonder, as I'm listening to the description that you're I guess what you're describing seems to me more like a moving target, which is why every few years when we have to survey that population, like their desires change, the situational contexts change, the technologies change. And so I wonder if it's even possible for us to have this ongoing understanding of a certain population, because over time, all of these are very contextual and they tend to shift.
Yep. I don't know, but again, in a Vera-like way, maybe if you had the centralized office and there's fantasy people who were then they're maybe in parallel, they're, I don't know what the right word is, connecting, facilitating research, but then periodically they're also interacting with those populations, maybe as part of a study. Maybe they piggyback onto the study or something. So they add questions, or they have a diagnostic part of the studies that go out periodically. So they're trying to keep an eye on, if you will, or keep track of shifts and various things for that community. I don't know. Yeah.
This discussion is making me realize that, and one, this is why I like cross-field collaborations, because I start to see things and I'm like, wait a minute, we need to write a different paper about this NSF grant that I'm on right now. But we're kind of in between ethnography and experimental in ways that might be useful. So, so this is actually a collaboration between NLP researchers at Columbia, social work researchers at Penn, and then linguist researchers formerly at Tennessee, now split between Tennessee and Michigan. And we're trying to build a model that will identify signifiers of grief in Black communities online, and trauma and stress in Black communities online. And the way that we're going about building the model is recruiting people from Harlem, and like we're sort of doing the community part that I did in Washington, D.C., where we've gone into these sources and sort of snowball sampled these people. But then they're sort of having a lab tech experiment kind of experience on their end, where they're being asked to blog about their feelings on this platform that we've created for a certain period of time. And so, you know, their experience is very M-Turkey kind of thing. And so it's kind of a blend of the two. And now I'm realizing, oh, that's actually kind of weird, and we should probably write about it. It would be probably helpful.
Wait, so I'm sorry, I missed that. Do you have an NSF grant now that this is a part of? That's what you're talking about?
Yes, yeah. So it's
And what is the grant for? What is the bigger?
So the grant is for the development of this model, that hopefully this language model that will hopefully be able then to be deployed on Facebook groups and Reddit, and kind of go, hey, wait a minute, there's something happening here. And so basically we have a language team that's making sure that African American English is being read correctly, which is my team. We have the NLP team that is making sure that the model works, and then we have the social work team that is like thinking about how you know, how this gets received and how people are engaging with it. But it really blends a very ethnographic approach with this very, I mean, they might as well be Mechanical Turk participants, except that they aren't Mechanical Turk participants. They're people that we went out and sought.
Is there a feedback part to this? I'm just curious. In other words, imagine you had the model in place. I mean, maybe this just making the models hard enough, but where once you start recognizing, or is that that must be part of the vision, that you then somehow go back to those people if you identify the grief. That's the whole point, right? Is those people may need help or may benefit from something, so you go back somehow.
I would imagine so. We just finished year one of the grant, so we're in the process of the first thing was building our platform that would collect all of this data. And so now we're collecting, and yeah, I think we will be circling back. But
so now I'm realizing,
I think there's kind of a way to be in between the deep anthropological, we're going to a small town in Bali and repeating our visits there for 15 years.
Or Tanzania is where we've gone, or Bolivia, or Ecuador in the jungle. Yes, all those places are places we went to, and you're not going unless you've been going for 20 years and have, you know, government approval. Yeah.
So I'm realizing too, this sort of more maybe practical or immediate is the So Vera, again, Vera's on my mind, but imagine for the moment it was in place, it's not in our plans, our resources, whatever, to do some of the things we're talking about. So I wonder, I mean, imagine a world where Vera was funded, so there's really motivation to do the second thing, where the second thing is a whole nother grant, a whole nother project that is this it's like Jesse, kind of the sort of cross-disciplinary, or Janine, in between sort of effort to seek out and establish relationships with those broader communities on a more permanent basis. And so like Vera would be the vehicle, or could be a vehicle or a mechanism by which that gets utilized, or kind of in both ways. Because if you don't have something in place that's going to sustain, that's going to help you make use of that, what you discover and all of that, then it's just a paper, not just, but then it's a paper, it's research, and you publish it, and that's the end of it.
I mean, another way to go is I recently was at a really nice set of talks on Alzheimer's, which something else that I do in another life, right? And there is really interesting sets of studies going on across multi-site studies, but what they're doing is setting up the sites to increase diversity. So they're basically setting up sites where they are sure they're going to tap into different types of people. And that might be a way of thinking about how to set up Vera to start. Because
what do you mean a site for what?
So there's it was all health related places, but they had targeted Detroit, they had targeted Florida, they had targeted Mississippi, right? So they get all these, California, they get all these different types of people at the sites, hopefully, and just thinking about the sites being a diverse group of people from the US, no matter how you kind of slice the diversity pie, right? And the funding was set up with all of these people having these sort of partnerships already with Alzheimer's clinics where they were. So you could imagine setting it up so you could have people who already have community partnerships set up, right? Thinking kind of somewhere between the ethnographer approach and the lab approach is oh, well, these people that are at this university already have a really nice community partnership. Maybe they're one of the first sites. And what you do is just try to get these sites set up where you get some diversity to start, and you're not trying to do everything at once. Because I think that's where you're right, Greg, it's impossible, right? You're never gonna, it could take forever to figure out what are all the factors. But if you just try to get a sampling that's decent to start, you get a lot of information.
So one of the things in Vera that we thought about related to that, and Tabitha, if she was here, she's assigned to be the PI who leads a committee that is all about the participant pool. And so one of the things we actually thought about some of this. I mean, I'm not saying we're the first people to think about it, but you can't do it all. I mean, there's no reason to do it all until there's a need. So one of the things was that committee would exist, and they would take interest from the community and then act on that interest to try to discover, set up this sort of relationship, that sort of thing you're describing. And if there wasn't a line of people wanting to do that, then they would
you could target.
You could target. That's right.
Yeah.
You'd try to go the other direction and figure it out. Yeah, it just makes so much sense to me to do that. But I just realized, I mean, it's so, and Stevie, you and I and Garrett in particular, we're spending a lot of time trying to sort out topics for this workshop. I was really thinking about things that were, I don't know how to put it, much more, we're just different. So this whole notion of, I don't even have the right communities, I haven't identified them, I don't know what's important to them. It's different in my mind. It was like, oh, how do I have a relationship with them? That presumes I know who they are, they want to be a part of this, and I just have to relate to them. I doesn't presume it, but that's like the limit, the extent of my thinking to this. And now it's like, whoa, wait a minute, wait a minute. I don't even know who they are. I don't even know that they want to be involved. I don't know who they are. So it's finding them, and then there's this whole part about the permanency.
Or what are the barriers to entry for them, right? I think that's a way of thinking about it. It's like you kind of know that you want to have a whole different sets of groups of people, but what are the barriers for all of those groups to entry? Maybe there aren't that many, maybe there are a lot, and maybe that you've never thought about them because you just haven't taken their perspective.
I mean, we thought about this for socioeconomic, barriers. So it's like sometimes hard to step away and see things, but like prolific. When we think about going to prolific and we're like looking at the database and saying how many people have headsets, we're, oh great, a bunch of people have headsets, and that's like you realize the only people you're getting are the people who can afford to buy headsets, who know about prolific, who are smart enough to be involved somehow, and they got in there.
Have the internet,
yeah, all of those things.
Like that's what COVID totally revealed to us, right? And like this again is where our library was so critical on campus. They took all the funds from the government and they bought wireless routers for all the students who were low SES, and they handed them out because they could not be in classes otherwise, right? So that's a huge barrier to entry, that if you're going to ship out these things, you might be shipping out a wireless connection with it as well, like they check out at libraries,
So I have no idea. It's like, if you
want the lower SES people, then that's something to think about. Maybe that's not who you target first. I don't know, right? So like I think it's thinking about these things as
we did as part of Vera too. We budgeted money for a part of it. We realized quickly. So our first vision was we're going to send kits, HMDs and stuff to individuals, and they're going to be part of the team. As soon as we started looking at the budget and all that, it's like, holy crap, that does not go very far. It is crazy. It does not go very far at all. So then it's like, okay, wait a minute. We got to leverage this existing population already has headsets. They know how to use them. We don't have to give them anything. They can be a part of this. Of course, then that means that they are those people like you just described. So, but we still are holding back money in the budget to provide resources for those people. But what we haven't really thought about is, and we did a little bit, but we just couldn't tackle everything. How do we find them? Who are they? How do we get them involved? How do
you're gonna have to look into the more grassroots organizations, and we've partnered with a lot of them in the downtown Atlanta area, and like we would create kiosks and participate in their local fairs, sort of get a sense for what people are able to do or not able to do, and whether they're even willing to put a headset on their heads.
I know, that's what I was gonna say.
It's a huge barrier.
People are scared of that now.
Yeah, like we live with it.
Not even due to COVID.
It.
Yeah, not even due to COVID, but also they're just scared of the technology. And it's like, this thing gonna like take away my privacy? Are you taking a picture of me? Like all of these things. Like I would never think of, people say this stuff.
Yeah.
It's crazy. I completely agree with that, Grace. I was like, that's going to be the barrier to entry, is who's afraid to put these things on, because they're like, what is this thing going to do to me?
Yep. And so just trying to get a wide age range and socioeconomic status people to even be willing to trust you enough, because first of all, they've had a long history of reasons not to trust you. So if you're like, look at me with this fancy technology, I swear I will make your life better, they won't trust you. They're like, who the hell are you? And why should I let you put this thing on my face? And so even getting to that point is going to require a lot of legwork. And so, I mean, it may be a lot more challenging because of the cultural differences that you may not even be aware of. Going in. So working with a lot of these grassroots organizations and just kind of even beginning with listening to what they do or do not, or are willing to be a part of, and starting from there may be a good starting point.
Jesse's comment is funny. Makes me think of my grandmother. I mean, deceased, but sometime long ago, she had VCR, right? VCR. If anybody remembers VCR, blinking clock, the whole bit. And my grandmother like just can't program it. She, for the life of her, she's like, she wants Judge Judy or whatever it is, and she can't figure it out. So I'm thinking, I'm a knight in shining armor. I'm going to bring in a TiVo. I mean, what could be better? You just say, I want Judge Judy. It figures it out. It finds it, puts it, like whatever at the time. I go to all this trouble. I buy a TiVo. I put it in for her. I get it already. And she hates it. And she just doesn't, like, and that's when I realized, oh, what she really needs is a toll-free number or phone number. That's what she needs. So she calls and says, I want Judge Judy. And somebody else programs her VCR to record Judge Judy. That's what she needs. She needs a human.
Yeah.
who can do that for her.
My nanny actually told me that she's convinced that Alexa is racist. She has a really thick Asian accent and cannot get Alexa to understand what she wants.
Alexa is racist. We have data on this.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't matter how many times
she's totally right. She's totally right. And the science
she's
is
like
there.
that Alexa won't listen to me.
Yep. Or I was back channeling with Valerie. I'm sorry, I'm gonna steal this tangent for a second. She and I were talking about Siri voices. I mean, so this is another thing to think about that's related to the talk that I was giving. But I had an experience that was just linguists being goofy and having fun after a few beers, and then realizing that we probably need to actually do this in an experimental setting at some point. But we spent a good part of an evening switching Siri to every language that about 6 of us had control and putting it into different genders in that language and asking it the same question. And the interpretation of the answers were fascinating, because like you get different intonational patterns, and sometimes it was programmed to not necessarily answer the question, probably because there was a dearth of input data, and so it would just skirt the question because it couldn't answer it. But you would get the impression like, oh, like Spanish female Siri is sassy, and and just like all of these extra language interpretations of the voice that was coming across in different languages and different genders. And it was it needs to be done in the lab.
That is awesome. It's funny. So I have a sort of, I don't know if it's a challenge, ask you guys, is there, not that I'm money hungry, but this is really interesting to me and I don't know how to do it without getting funding. Is there a separate, if Vera existed, it'd be great because it would fit together, but imagine it didn't. Is there a separate NSF proposal, for example, here, which is not to find the populations and find those people, not for very specific populations, but I'm saying general research that is much more diverse and in every way we can think of, the SES, whatever, all sorts of things, but to sort of do 2 things. One is maybe practically identify populations in XR, let's just say regional, geographic, I don't know, maybe it's nationwide, but then also to build up knowledge about how you do this. What are the places, where the place you go, the procedure you use, the language you use, so that others who later want to do this for their own communities or their own people, they have a starting place. They know lists of places they could go, words to use, how do I approach the people, what's important to typically to these populations. Yeah, that's what I'm asking, is there, I wonder if there is I have no idea where it would get funded or who would fund it, but something that would involve like linguists, ethnographers, computer scientists, psychologists.
There's a grant pipeline called Build and Broaden that might be an opportunity for that.
Is that
Yeah,
NSF
and it's new NSF direct initiative. But I was going to say exactly the same thing. I think it's a good fit.
Okay. Do you guys I mean, this is one of these things where I could run for weeks or months, like, oh, this is such the greatest idea, and then I find out, oh, somebody else already done this. Not that I'm offended that someone else saw it before me, but just that it's like, I just don't, I know so little. And so, here I spent all this time thinking I'm going to figure all this out. It's like somebody else already figured this out. There, people deal with this already.
I think that people have figured some of this out for like general psychology studies or general user studies, but not like for XR specifically.
And it's not very systematic. If they have figured it out,
it's pieces of it. It's like, oh, you should write your
you should
informed
contact
consent
so-and-so
in this way.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
It's very piecemeal.
I'm looking at the webpage, Jesse. It's interesting.
Yeah, it
When I'm
might
just
not,
looking at
I now say that it's particularly asking for HBCUs, but yeah.
Nope. When I saw that though, I was just in the 30 seconds of looking over it, I thought of Valerie, and Valerie for the Vera, for this proposal we did to NSF for Vera and CCRI, Valerie was trying up until the very end to work with some HBCUs, to people she knows at different universities, to get them involved in some way as partners or something. And she just, I think it was just too hard in the end. And I think part of it was communication, or this linguistic stuff, but it was just their, and part of it is practical, like their uncertainty about like, what does this mean? What do I have to do? What am I committing to? What is this, like, am I being used or whatever? I don't know, but it's interesting because
we work a ton with Spelman College, which is a HBCU, and so
sure. Yeah.
I also have a postdoc that just went to Morehouse, and he's he
have
does XR
Morehouse
research, so I don't know why he wouldn't want to be involved. That's another option.
Yep. But speaking of breaks, I think I have hit I need to go to bed time here.
I promised myself I was going to go to bed a half an hour ago, and here I am.
I thought we were going to go to lunch.
And then you all got super interesting, so I was like, ah.
It's like, all right, I guess we're staying.
Should we call Valerie quickly, wake her up, tell her like, Valerie,
you're missing out on the fun.
That's right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Let's take a break. So Stevie, Garrett, and I will at least be back at what time? Oh.
45. Yeah.
Right. 12:45. And that way, if anybody else is paying attention, they can join in too. So the rest of you guys, great to see you. I want to continue this
conversation. Thank you for organizing it.
I don't know. Yeah. If anybody has any ideas or energy, wants to look or think more, please do. But otherwise, I will try to. I got to get some other things out of the way. But I feel like there's something here, and it feels
I
like
like
something
the idea of this NSF grant.
And I think I'm just trying to think. I mean, if I know you guys got to go, but if we could flesh out the ideas enough that then maybe we could even have some discussions with some program directors at NSF. Just say, here's the general thing we want to do. Help us. Where would we go? What would we do? I wouldn't want to do that until we had a little more fleshed out thinking. But okay. Sleep well, guys. Thanks for staying up with us.
Bye.
Thank you. Enjoy Singapore.
Bye-bye. Thanks. Bye.
See you.